Welcome back, legends. You're at Wizardium. Another incredible story awaits. What if Harry and Hermione inherited all the Pureblood Lordships at age 11? Subscribe and hit the bell. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. The weight of old names. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow. Important things Harry had always thought should at least have the decency to arrive on a dramatic day. A storm, maybe, thunder. Not a Tuesday in July with Mrs. Fig's cat yowling next door and Dudley's television blaring through the ceiling. There were 11 of them. Harry sat on the edge of his cot in the cupboard under the stairs, his last morning in it as it happened, because Dudley had recently decided he needed a second bedroom for his second television, and counted the owls through the tiny gap under the door. He could hear them landing on the windowsill, on the banister, on Aunt Petunia's prized decorative plant stand. He could hear her shrieking. He could hear Uncle Vernon's thunderous footsteps and the specific shade of fury in his voice that meant something had gone categorically wrong with the normalcy Vernon Dursley had spent his entire adult life constructing. The letters slid under the door one by one, as if the owls had been trained for exactly this situation. Perhaps they had. The envelopes were different colors, cream, silver, one deep green, one that shimmered faintly gold in the thin light, and they were all addressed in the same precise, formal script. Harry James Potter, Lord of the ancient and most noble houses of Potter, Peveril and Gryffindor, heir apparent to the House of Black. Then below that, a Gringotts seal. Harry read that address 4 times. He was fairly sure he'd been Harry Potter his whole life. He'd been quite sure it was just the 2 names and none of the other parts. He opened the first letter. The Gringotts letter was written in a language that was simultaneously dry as old parchment and absolutely staggering in its implications. It informed him, in the polite but utterly inflexible tone of an institution that had been handling other people's money since before the Norman conquest, that a full inheritance reading had been triggered by his approaching 11th birthday and the attendant activation of his magical majority indicators. It informed him that the reading was not optional. It informed him that a portkey had been included with the letter, the silver token, round and flat, tucked in the envelope's corner, and that it would activate at 9 o'clock on the morning of July 31st, his birthday, and deposit him at the private client entrance of Gringotts Bank, Diagon Alley. It informed him that the reading was expected to take most of the morning. It did not tell him why. Harry held the silver token and thought about the Dursleys. He thought about 11 years of "You're not special, boy, and there's nothing remarkable about you, and stop making things up." He thought about the way Vernon had once snapped a school report in half because Harry had scored higher than Dudley, and the way Petunia flinched every time the word magic entered the house, even by accident. He thought about his parents, who he knew almost nothing about except that they died and left him here. Then he put the silver token in his pocket and started reading the other 10 letters. Gringotts at 9 in the morning was a different creature than Gringotts at noon. The great marble hall was quieter, the goblin tellers engaged in the meticulous early work of the day, the vast doors throwing long rectangles of pale summer light across the stone floors. Harry had arrived via portkey on a side street and walked in through a small door he hadn't known existed, guided by a goblin who introduced himself as Sharpclaw and then said nothing else until they were through a series of corridors that grew progressively more ornate and significantly less public. The room they stopped in was lined with dark wood and had a fire burning despite the July heat. 3 goblins sat behind a curved desk. 4th, older than the others by the look of his hands and the particular gravity of his expression, stood to one side. "Harry James Potter," said the standing goblin. "I am Ragnok. I am the Senior Director of Inheritance and Estate. You should understand that this reading was triggered automatically and that its results are binding under both goblin law and the oldest strata of wizarding contract magic, which predate the Ministry of Magic by several centuries and are not subject to its jurisdiction." He paused. "Do you understand what I have said?" "I think so," Harry said. "The Ministry can't change it." Ragnok looked faintly pleased, the way a professor looks when a student gives the right answer unexpectedly. "Sit down, Lord Potter." Harry sat down. He noticed that Ragnok had called him Lord Potter without any particular ceremony, the way you'd say "pass the salt," as if it was simply his name. The reading took 2 hours. Most of it was Ragnok and the 3 seated goblins going through documents in a methodical, unhurried way while Harry asked questions, and the goblins answered them with a directness he found, after 11 years of being managed and deflected and carefully not told things, genuinely startling. Yes, his parents had left him a significant vault. Yes, it had been accruing interest for 10 years. No withdrawals had been made on his behalf. Here Ragnok's expression shifted in a way that suggested strong feelings being professionally suppressed, since a single withdrawal of funds made shortly after his parents' death for purposes listed in Gringotts records as miscellaneous childrearing expenses. "Who made that withdrawal?" Harry asked. "Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore," said Ragnok, in the tone of someone reading a name they have strong opinions about, "acting under temporary guardianship instrument that expired under standard magical law when you were placed with non-magical relatives." Harry filed that away. He had a lot of things to file away this morning. The Lordships came at the end. Ragnok walked him through them one by one, with the 3 seated goblins producing documents as needed. House Potter, straightforward, direct patrilineal inheritance, no complications. House Peverell, dormant for generations, activated through the Potter line's oldest documented ancestry, and the fact that Harry apparently had had possession of 2 of the 3 Deathly Hallows his entire life without knowing it, the invisibility cloak being in Dumbledore's possession and technically his by right. House Gryffindor, Harry actually said sorry, what out loud at this one, which Ragnok acknowledged with something that might have been a smile on a face not designed for smiling. The Gryffindor line had wound its way through several centuries of obscure marriages and a notable number of magical adoption contracts until it terminated in a legal sense in James Potter's grandmother. So I'm a descendant of Godric Gryffindor, Harry said slowly. Distant, said Ragnok, but sufficient. The Black Lordship was the complicated one. Harry wasn't technically inheriting it. Sirius Black, despite being in Azkaban, was still legally alive and the lord of that house. What Harry held was the heir apparent designation, which carried its own specific weight. He was entitled to certain Black family resources, had a voice on certain estate decisions, and was, in the event of Sirius Black's death, the primary beneficiary. This had been arranged, Ragnok explained, by Sirius Black himself in the hours before his arrest, via an emergency instrument filed with Gringotts directly. He had time to file paperwork, Harry said. Lord Black was meticulous in certain things, Ragnok said, in a way that suggested Sirius had been many things and meticulous was not generally high on the list, but when it mattered, he'd come through. Harry walked out of Gringotts 2 hours after he'd walked in, into the bright chaos of Diagon Alley on a summer morning. He was wearing the same oversized clothes he'd put on that morning in the cupboard under the stairs. His hair was, as always, a disaster. He had a small card in his pocket that was his key to a vault containing more money than he could mentally process, and a leather folder of documents that established him as the lord of 3 ancient houses with a 4th pending. He stood on the Gringotts steps and felt the sun on his face and thought, right then. He bought himself a birthday pasty from a cart near the entrance to Nocturne Alley and ate it sitting on the steps of the apothecary, reading through the documents a second time and making notes in the margin with a quill he'd purchased from a stall for 2 nuts, because whatever else was happening today, he was going to understand it. That was where he heard the argument. It was coming from the direction of Gringotts, specifically from the side entrance he'd used, which he could see from his position on the apothecary steps. A girl his age, bushy-haired and furious, was standing on the pavement with a folder of documents pressed to her chest and 2 adults who were clearly her parents hovering behind her with the specific expression of people who have been told something impossible and are processing it in real time. I understand that it's unusual, the girl was saying to a Gringotts goblin who stood in the doorway with the patient expression of someone who deals with humans all day and has made his peace with it. I'm not disputing the reading. I'm asking you to explain the mechanism by which a Muggle-born witch can inherit a pureblood lordship, because my understanding of inheritance law is that the bloodline, your understanding of inheritance law, said the goblin who Harry was fairly sure was also Ragnok though he'd gone back inside, is based on ministry-published texts which are in our assessment incomplete. Then give me the complete version. A pause. Ragnok looked at her for a moment with that same faint impression of being pleased. There is a reading list included in your inheritance packet, Miss Granger. Start with bloodright and binding, magical inheritance before the statute of secrecy. It will answer most of your questions, and the rest of them, you are welcome to schedule a follow-up appointment. The door closed with the quiet finality of Gringotts doors everywhere. The girl Granger stared at it for a moment, then turned to her parents and said, I need to go to Flourish and Blots. Hermione, said her mother, who looked like someone had recently hit her gently over the head with a fascinating but confusing book. Perhaps we should find somewhere to sit down first. I can sit down in the bookshop, said Hermione Granger, and turned around and walked directly into Harry, who had approached without particularly meaning to, drawn by the argument the way he was always drawn by arguments that had interesting things at their center. They looked at each other. She had brown eyes and an expression that reminded Harry strongly of himself in the immediate aftermath of finding out something significant, that particular mix of I need to process this and I need more information, and underneath it all, barely visible, the thing that neither of them would have been able to name yet, which was everything I thought I knew about where I fit in the world is no longer accurate. Sorry, said Harry. Were you just arguing with a Gringotts senior director? I was having a discussion, she said. He won technically, but he respected the questions. She looked at his folder. You've had a reading too. Birthday today, Harry said. Mine was yesterday. They sent a portkey. She glanced at the documents under his arm. How many? 3 lordships and a pending. She blinked. 2 and an additional designation I don't fully understand yet. My parents are, she glanced back at them, taking it very well considering they thought I was just going to school. They didn't know about the lordships before. Nobody knew, that's the part I can't quite, she stopped. Sorry, I'm Hermione Granger, Harry Potter, a pause that had several layers to it. She looked at his forehead briefly the way everyone did and then looked back at his face, which not everyone bothered with. Are you staying in Diagon Alley? I need to get my school things and I'm going to need to research the inheritance documents, and I work better when I can talk through things. Harry thought about going back to the Dursleys. He thought about the cupboard that was now Dudley's storage room and the slightly larger bedroom he'd been allocated with all the warmth of a business transaction, and the fact that today was his birthday and nobody at number 4 Privet Drive had acknowledged it. I was going to do the same thing, he said. I work better when I can talk through things too. He wasn't sure that was entirely true. He'd spent most of his life thinking through things alone because there'd been nobody to talk them through with, but he thought it might become true given the right circumstances. Hermione Granger gave him a look that suggested she was doing a quick and fairly comprehensive assessment of him, and then she said, "All right," and turned to her parents. "Mum, Dad, this is Harry Potter. He's had his inheritance reading as well. We're going to research together while you look around the alley." Her mother looked at Harry with the expression of a sensible woman who has just watched her daughter make a decision and knows from experience that the decision is already made. "Is that all right with you, Harry?" "Yes, Mrs. Granger," Harry said. She smiled at him, a warm and slightly tired smile. "You can call me Emma. This has been a rather big morning." They went to Flourish and Blots first because Hermione considered it essential groundwork, and Harry didn't disagree. They found a table in the back of the shop near the magical theory section, while Emma and Daniel Granger went to look at the Hogwarts supply list items with the shell-shocked cheerfulness of two people determined to be supportive of a situation they didn't yet fully understand. Hermione had her folder open before she sat down. Harry had his out a moment later. They worked in silence for several minutes, which was the kind of silence that is actually very loud internally. "My birth name connects to Dagworth Granger," Hermione said eventually, tapping a page in her documents. "There was a Hector Dagworth Granger in the 19th century. He was famous in potions, apparently, and somehow there's a squib line that goes through non-magical families for several generations and ends up in mine. Gringotts instruments track magical inheritance through blood regardless of expression. So the line goes, famous potions master, several squib descendants, eventually my grandfather, my mother who doesn't have magic me. So you are pureblood by ancestry," Harry said, "just with several generations of non-magical expression in between, which makes me not pureblood by any definition the current wizarding world uses," she said, "but makes me legally eligible for the lordship by the standards of the inheritance instruments which predate the current definitions." She looked up. "Does that strike you as relevant?" "It strikes me as the thing that will make certain people extremely angry," Harry said. "Yes," she said, with the expression of someone who has noted the probability of being made extremely angry and has decided to proceed anyway. She turned a page. "The Selwyn connection is through a different mechanism, a magical adoption oath sworn 3 generations back that the Selwyn family attempted to revoke but couldn't under Goblin law. And Bones is—" "Wait," Harry said. "Bones as in the family that—" "As in the family with a living member currently serving in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Yes, Amelia Bones." Hermione's voice was careful. "There's a cadet line that ended, and a guardianship oath that transferred to my bloodline, and I have the lordship of the cadet designation but not, it's complicated. I don't affect Amelia Bones' position in the main house, it's more like having a footnote." "A lordship as a footnote," Harry said. "The wizarding world seems to run on footnotes," Hermione said. "Your thoughts on the Gryffindor situation?" Harry had actually been finding the Gryffindor inheritance the most interesting, partly because of its historical weight, and partly because of what it implied about the school he was about to attend. "I think it means I technically have standing over certain decisions in the school that's named after one of my ancestors," he said. "I haven't worked out exactly what that means yet. The documents reference something called Founders' Protocols, but I can't find the source text." "I found it," Hermione said, sliding a book across the table without looking up. "Bookmark on page 212. Harry looked at her. She was still reading her own documents. He picked up the book. "You found this in the last 20 minutes, he said. "I was looking for it," she said. "I noticed the reference in my own documents. The Selwyn line has a minor clause related to Slytherin Founders' Protocols, which is either coincidence or deeply ironic, and I asked the shop assistant about the source text. She knew immediately. Apparently it's not a common request." "I'd imagine not," Harry said, and started reading. By noon they had covered the theoretical groundwork and moved on to practical implications, which Harry found easier to think about, and Hermione found simultaneously easier and more disturbing. The Founders' Protocols, as far as they could determine, established that recognized lords of houses affiliated with the 4 founder lines held certain inviolable rights within Hogwarts itself, rights that had been dormant so long as to be essentially forgotten, but which the magical contracts underlying the school's construction treated as permanent: rights of speech, rights of challenge, the right to petition the castle's magic directly in cases where the established authority had failed in its fundamental duty of care. "Dumbledore is going to find this interesting," Harry said. "That's one word for it," said Hermione. "You don't like him." She considered this with the carefulness she seemed to apply to most things. "I don't know him. But I know that according to these documents, He made a financial decision on your behalf using an authority he didn't legitimately hold after a certain date. And I know that you've apparently been living in a non-magical household for 10 years without any intervention or support from the magical world. And I know that you didn't find out about any of this until today. She tapped her folder. I try not to form strong opinions without full information. But I've noted some preliminary concerns. Harry thought about the withdrawal listed in the Gringotts documents, miscellaneous child-rearing expenses. He thought about 10 years of sleeping in a cupboard. Preliminary concerns, he said. Yeah, we should get our school things, Hermione said, closing her folder with a decisive snap. I want ones from Ollivander's before the afternoon rush. Harry stood up and gathered his documents. He was aware, standing there in the back of flourish and blots on his 11th birthday with a folder establishing him as the Lord of 3 houses and a pasty still half-eaten in his jacket pocket, that something had changed in the fabric of his day, in the fabric of his life, in some way he couldn't yet fully articulate. It wasn't the lordships exactly, though those were significant. It was the conversation. It was having someone look at the same documents he was looking at and immediately start working, not performing shock, not deferring to adults, just working the way he'd always wanted to work through the large and confusing things in his life and never quite had anyone to do it with. Hermione, he said. She looked up from putting her own documents away. I think we're going to be friends, he said, not as a wish or a question, as an assessment, the way Ragnarok had said Lord Potter. She looked at him steadily. I think so too, she said. Don't be late for Ollivander's, he's particular about appointments. Ollivander smelled of wood shavings and something older, something Harry's magic, and he was beginning to understand it was magic, that particular hum in his fingertips that he'd always had and always been told was nothing, recognized and responded to before he'd gotten through the door. Hermione went first. She came out with a vinewood wand, 10 3/4 inches dragon heartstring. Ollivander described it in his particular oblique way as a wand that chose witches of outstanding intellect and a fierce moral drive. And Hermione accepted this with the expression of someone who has been told a true thing and is deciding how to feel about it. Harry went in. Ollivander measured him, all of him, wrist to shoulder, shoulder to nose, nose to left ear in total silence, and then disappeared into the rows of boxes and came back with a wand that Harry tried and promptly caused a rain of sparks to fall on Ollivander's good hat, which was apparently not a good sign. 3 more wands, 2 more minor incidents. Then Ollivander stopped. He stood very still, with the particular stillness of someone who has just made a connection they'd rather not make. I wonder, he said quietly, almost to himself, and went to the back of the shop. He came back with a box that he handled differently than the others, more carefully, or perhaps it wasn't care so much as caution. Holly and phoenix feather, said Ollivander. 11 inches, nice and supple. The phoenix who gave this feather gave only one other, and I think you know, Mr. Potter, where that other wand found its master. Harry took the wand. The warmth that ran up his arm was nothing like the minor flickers of the previous wands. It was like putting your hand into a beam of sunlight after a long winter. It was like the first breath after being underwater. His magic, that thing he'd been told was nothing, was freakish, was stopped doing that immediately. It rose to meet the wand with an ease that felt like recognition. Curious, said Ollivander. Very curious. Because of the brother wand? Harry asked. Yes. And because, Ollivander paused, tilting his head in that particular way, you carry a great deal of inheritance with you, Mr. Potter, more than most. I wonder if you understand what that means in terms of what you might be asked to do with it. I'm working on understanding, Harry said. Yes. Ollivander looked at him, and there was something in those pale eyes that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, and was partly, Harry thought, the expression of someone watching a story that they have a small part in and already know ends significantly. I imagine you are. They had late lunch at the Leaky Cauldron with the Grangers, who had recovered from the morning with what Harry was coming to understand was a characteristic resilience. Emma Granger asked sharp questions and noted the answers carefully, and Daniel Granger made dry jokes and was clearly doing the same. So just to confirm, Daniel said, cutting into a sandwich, our daughter at age 11 is a noblewoman in a society that didn't know she existed 4 hours ago. Noblewoman, Hermione corrected. Technically, the Dagworth Granger title carries a lady's designation and the Selwyn subsidiary too. 3 noblewomen, said Harry. Hermione shot him a look. I'm counting the Bones cadet line, he said. That's a stretch, she said. The Bones cadet line is a footnote. Still counts. Emma Granger was watching this exchange with an expression that suggested she was updating a mental file in real time. And you, Harry, you have family who know about this. My aunt and uncle, Harry said. They won't. He kept his voice level. They don't involve themselves in the magical world. Emma looked at him with the specific quality of attention that some adults had when they were hearing something they suspected was incomplete and were deciding how hard to press. She said, I see, and then after a pause, are you all right? It was the first time anyone had asked him that today, possibly in longer than today. The question caught him slightly off guard, the way simple things sometimes did. I'm better than I was this morning, he said honestly. That's a reasonable answer for a birthday. Emma looked at her husband. Something passed between them in the particular quiet language of people who have been together a long time. Daniel said, we're driving back through Surrey on our way home if you'd like a lift. "That's not on your way," Harry said. "We're happy to adjust our route," Emma said, and that was the end of that particular discussion. In the back of the Granger's car, heading south through the afternoon, Harry had the documents in his lap and was making a list in his school notebook, one of the ones he'd bought that morning, which was already acquiring the density of annotation of someone who takes notes seriously. Hermione, beside him, had her own notebook and was cross-referencing goblin inheritance law with the reading list Ragnarok had given her. The list Harry was making was titled at the top, "Things that need addressing," which was understated to a degree he appreciated. Item 1, the unauthorized withdrawal. He needed to understand what it had been spent on and whether that was recoverable, and what the legal implications were of Dumbledore acting under an expired authority. Item 2, the invisibility cloak. Ragnarok had been very clear that the cloak was his property, currently in Dumbledore's possession, and that he had the full right to request its return. Item 3, Sirius Black. This one he circled twice. His godfather, he had a godfather, he hadn't known that this morning, was in Azkaban for crimes that Ragnarok had, in the dry and legally careful language of goblins, characterized as pending formal evidentiary review. Harry didn't know what that meant exactly, but he knew it meant someone thought there was something to review. Item 4, the Founders' Protocols and what they meant at Hogwarts practically. Item 5, a line he wrote and then stared at for a while. Voldemort is not actually gone. He'd found this in a subdocument attached to the Peverell inheritance materials. The Peverell instruments tracked the status of the Deathly Hallows, and there was a notation, dry, factual, thoroughly unsettling, indicating that the current status of the Resurrection Stone was listed as unknown, last associated with a living magical person of sufficient blood tie to trigger tracking protocols. The tracking notation had last been updated 2 years ago in Albania. Something was alive in Albania, something the tracking protocols associated with the Peverell bloodline's darkest instrument. "Hermione," he said, "third paragraph from the bottom on page 3 of the Selwyn documentation," she said without looking up. "I found the same notation, different instrument, same trail." Harry looked at her. "You're not surprised?" "I'm very surprised," she said. "I'm just not letting it stop me reading." She turned a page. "He never fully died, did he? The information on the event at Godric's Hollow suggests the killing curse rebounded. That's the standard account, but a rebounded killing curse doesn't create a soul fragment unless there was already a pre-existing magical disruption to the soul structure, which means whatever he was doing before he came after your family." She paused. "This is going to take a while to properly research." "We have a year," Harry said. "We have September through June," she said. "Less if we factor in exams." A brief pause. "I think we should establish ground rules for Hogwarts." "You want ground rules," Harry said. "Not rules exactly, priorities. We have resources that most first-year students don't have access to. Financial, legal, social. We need to decide how we want to use them before someone else decides for us." Harry thought about Dumbledore, about being managed, about miscellaneous child-rearing expenses. "We don't hide what we know," he said. "And we don't let anyone use us as pieces in their strategy without our consent." "Yes," Hermione said. "That's what I was thinking too." She glanced out the window at the passing countryside. "I'm going to need the summer to research properly, but I've already sent an owl to Gringotts requesting a full copy of the inheritance law texts and a secondary appointment in August. I need to send some owls too," Harry said. He thought about the letter he intended to send to Dumbledore, not angry, not demanding, but clear. "I know about the withdrawal. I know about the cloak. I'd like to speak with you before term starts." The kind of letter that established, quietly and undeniably, that Harry Potter was not the passive piece on the board he'd been expected to be. The car moved through the warm summer afternoon. Outside the window, the ordinary world went about its ordinary business. Inside, 2 11-year-olds who had each woken up that morning as one thing and were going to bed as something significantly different sat quietly with their notes and their questions and their new unexpected sense of company. "Harry," Hermione said, just before they turned onto the road that would eventually reach Privet Drive. "Yeah, happy birthday." He'd almost forgotten. "Thanks," he said, and then, because it was true, it was a good one. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the Gringotts door after Ragnarok closed it, assessing, but with something warmer behind it. Then she went back to her notes. The car drove on into the long July evening, and behind them, in a direction neither of them was looking, the wizarding world continued to operate on assumptions that were already, though it didn't know it yet, out of date. Chapter 2, The Sorting of Lords. The Hogwarts Express left from platform 9 3/4 at 11 o'clock sharp, which Harry knew because Hermione had sent him a letter in August outlining the departure logistics, the recommended arrival window, and a brief note at the bottom that said, "I've also compiled a reading list for the train. Don't feel obligated, but I'm bringing copies." He'd written back, "Bring copies." They'd exchanged 14 letters over the summer. Harry had spent most of July and August in his new bedroom at Privet Drive, which was larger than the cupboard and had a window, and which he'd turned into a functional research space that drove Aunt Petunia to a specific brand of tight-lipped fury, because she couldn't technically object to a child reading. Vernon had tried once to confiscate the books. Harry had looked at him with an expression that was entirely new, calm, direct, without the usual anxious shrinking, and said, "Those are my property, purchased with money from my family's vault. You're welcome to speak with Gringotts about your legal standing to remove them." He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. Vernon had put the books down and left the room. Harry had been slightly surprised by this. Then he'd thought about it and understood. The Dursleys' power over him had always been predicated on his believing he had nowhere else to go. That belief was no longer accurate, and somehow, through his posture, his voice, the quality of stillness he'd found over the summer in those hours of reading, he'd communicated that without saying it directly. Dumbledore had written back. The letter had been long and warm and carefully worded in the way of a man who chooses every phrase with precision. It spoke of Harry's parents with genuine affection. It explained the invisibility cloak as something held in trust, a protective decision, though it acknowledged, in one elegant subordinate clause, that perhaps the timing of its return might be reconsidered. It said nothing at all about the withdrawal. Harry had written back a shorter letter. He was returning the cloak to his possession at Gringotts as of September 1st. He looked forward to meeting the headmaster in person. He hoped they would have the opportunity for a full and direct conversation about the guardianship decisions made on his behalf. He'd had Gringotts forward a formal notification of the cloak's retrieval to Dumbledore simultaneously. Belt and braces, Hermione had suggested. Don't let him defer. The cloak was now in his trunk, folded carefully on top of his robes. Platform 9 3/4 hit him like a wall of color and noise, and the specific charged feeling of a lot of magic in a compressed space. Steam billowed, owls shrieked. A set of twins with identical grins were levitating their mother's handbag 30 feet in the air and laughing when she couldn't reach it. And somewhere down the platform a small boy was crying about leaving his toad. Harry stood still for a moment and just let it wash over him. The magical world. His world, in some fundamental way, he was only beginning to properly inhabit. "You're doing the thing," said Hermione, appearing at his shoulder with a trolley stacked considerably higher than was probably structurally advisable. Emma and Daniel Granger stood a few paces behind, doing the thing parents do at platforms, which is pretending they aren't watching their child very carefully. "What thing?" Harry said. "The standing still absorbing everything thing. You did it at Diagon Alley too." She said it without criticism, observational. "We should find a compartment before the good ones go." Harry said a quick goodbye to the Grangers. Emma hugged him, which caught him off guard but wasn't unwelcome, and they made their way down the platform. He noticed the looks. Some were the standard is that Harry Potter double takes he'd been getting since Diagon Alley. Others were different, coming from older students and a few adults on the platform, the particular sharpened attention of people who'd heard something, who'd been in the right ears to the ground circles over the summer. Word had gotten out, not everything but enough. The heir to House Potter was starting Hogwarts, and he wasn't who anyone had expected. He found a compartment near the middle of the train, and hefted their trunks onto the racks with more ease than 11 should probably allow. His magic, since the wand, had become easier to access in small unconscious ways, not spells but simple extensions of will, and they settled in as the platform began to thin. The door slid open 20 minutes later, and a red-haired boy with a smudge of something on his nose looked in with the hopeful expression of someone who has left it too late to be choosy about compartments. "Everywhere else is full," he said. "Can I come in?" Harry said. The boy sat down, took in Harry and Hermione with a quick assessment and said, "I'm Ron Weasley. Harry Potter, Hermione Granger." Ron's eyes went briefly to Harry's forehead, then back. He had the decency to do this quickly. "So it's true then about the Lordships. Apparently word travels fast," Hermione said, not unkindly. "My mum knows everyone," Ron said, with the particular tone of a person who finds this quality in a parent simultaneously useful and mortifying. "She said," he stopped, looking like he was editing in real time. "What did she say?" Harry asked. "That you'd had a Gringotts reading and come out with 3 titles, and that Dumbledore was," she said, thoughtful, but she made the face she makes when she means something else. He shrugged. "I don't actually care about all that. Are you going to be in Gryffindor?" "I have no idea," Harry said honestly. "You, probably. We're all Gryffindors. Mum, Dad, all my brothers." He said it the way you say things that are both pride and weight. "Bill and Charlie have already left. Percy's a prefect." "Fred and George are the ones who were levitating your mother's handbag," Hermione said. "Yeah," Ron grinned, sudden and genuine, and it changed his whole face. "I'm hoping they're not prefects ever. It'd ruin them." The train moved. England unreeled past the windows in summer green and gold. They talked the way people talk on trains, easily without the social scaffolding of fixed locations, the compartment creating its own small world. Ron was funny in the dry, self-deprecating way of someone who has grown up the 6th of 7 children and learned early that the best way to hold space was to make people laugh. He knew a great deal about Quidditch and not much about academic magic, and he was honest about both without being particularly bothered by either. He looked at the density of annotation in the books Harry had open on the seat beside him and said, "Blimey, do you actually enjoy that?" "Yeah," Harry said. Ron looked at Hermione's stack, which was denser. "Do you live in that?" "I find it relaxing," Hermione said. Ron considered this. "My brother Percy says that too, no offense." "None taken," she said. "I've been told worse." Draco Malfoy arrived at their compartment door somewhere past Birmingham with two large boys arranged behind him like architecture and the particular expression of someone who has been told his whole life that walking into a room constitutes an entrance worth making. He looked at Harry. "Harry Potter," he said. "I'm Draco Malfoy." Harry had read about the Malfoys over the summer. He knew the family history, old blood, old money, a notable flexibility about which side they were on when flexibility was most financially advisable. He knew Lucius Malfoy had escaped Azkaban after Voldemort's fall by claiming to have been under the Imperious Curse. He knew the name carried weight in wizarding politics. He knew Draco specifically had been discussed in two of the letters Hermione had forwarded to him, secondary research on the families most likely to be antagonistic toward the changes in the political landscape that their inheritance represented. He also knew, looking at Draco Malfoy now, that the boy was doing everything exactly as he'd been trained to do it and had no idea that the training had already been made obsolete. "Draco," Harry said pleasantly. Draco blinked. He'd expected either awe or nervousness. He recalibrated, which Harry could see him do, a slight shift, moving to the secondary playbook. His eyes moved to Ron. "Weasley," he said in the specific tone of a person who finds the presence of another person instructive about the first person's judgment. "I'd have thought you'd want better company for your first day." "I like this company," Harry said before Ron could answer, still pleasant. "Were you looking for a seat?" Another blink. "I was introducing myself." "You did that. I'm Harry, as you said. That's Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley." A pause. "Did you want something else?" Draco looked at him for a long moment. Harry looked back without particular hostility or particular warmth, the way you look at someone you're still deciding about, which was exactly where he was with Draco Malfoy. There was something in Draco's face below the performance, something that looked, briefly and quickly covered, like uncertainty. Like a boy who had been handed a script and is beginning to suspect the audience has seen it before. "I heard about your inheritance reading," Draco said. "Most people seem to have." "My father was surprised," Draco said. The word surprised was doing significant structural work in that sentence. "I imagine he was," Harry said. He left a space for Draco to fill if he wanted to, the kind of space you left when you genuinely didn't know yet what someone was made of underneath. Draco didn't fill it. He looked at Harry one more time, then at Hermione, and that look was different, sharp in a different way, with something at the back of it that might have been recalculation, and then he left. Ron let out a long breath. "That's not how I expected that to go." "How did you expect it to go?" Hermione asked. "Dunno, worse." He looked at Harry. "He usually just says something awful and walks off pleased with himself." "He didn't know what to say," Harry said. "That's not the same as being a decent person, but it's a starting point." They arrived at Hogsmeade Station as the sun finished setting, which meant Hogwarts appeared to them across the lake in the dark, lit from within, massive and improbable and absolutely real. Harry stood in one of the boats and looked at it and felt something that had no clean name, something like coming back to a place you'd only ever dreamed about. "It's real," Hermione said beside him, not to him specifically. "Just acknowledging the fact." "Yeah," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then I read the founding documents in August. Hogwarts was built by 4 people who believed that magic should be taught to everyone who had it, regardless of anything else. That was the original premise." She watched the castle come closer across the water. "It moved away from that. I want to know when and why." "That's a question for a while from now," Ron said from the other boat, which was close enough to overhear. "I know," she said. "I'm noting it, for later." Professor McGonagall met them in the entrance hall with the particular quality of authority that needs no announcement. She simply stood there and the hall organized itself accordingly. She was examining the cluster of nervous first-years with sharp eyes when they landed on Harry and held for precisely 3 seconds longer than anyone else. Something moved in her expression, controlled and quick but present. Then her eyes moved to Hermione and held there too. Harry thought, she knows, of course she knew. McGonagall had been at Hogwarts for decades. She would have seen the Gringotts notice. All teachers of sufficient rank were informed when a student of notable inheritance was incoming. It was in the Founders' Protocols, buried in a subsection Hermione had found in her 3rd week of summer research and highlighted with 3 different colors. McGonagall said, "Welcome to Hogwarts," to all of them, and then the sorting began. The Great Hall was everything. Harry walked in and felt the Gryffindor inheritance in his chest, a warmth that wasn't quite pride, more like recognition, like passing a house where someone you loved once lived. The ceiling was the sky, dark and star-scattered. The 4 tables stretched the length of the hall and 1,000 candles floated overhead, and every face in the room was turned toward the line of first-years filing in. The sorting hat sat on its stool. It opened its brim and sang a song about the houses, their qualities, but with something underneath this year that felt different, almost pointed. When it reached the verse about Gryffindor, it said something about old blood returning to old stones, and Harry saw McGonagall's chin lift slightly. Dumbledore at the high table had an expression of perfect serenity that was somehow the most alert expression in the room. They were called alphabetically. Harry watched Hermione go up, her back very straight, the hat dropping over her hair, and watched the hat take longer with her than it had taken with anyone so far. He could see her lips moving. She was arguing with the hat. The hat said Gryffindor, with what seemed like gusto. Hermione came to the Gryffindor table with the expression of someone who has won a negotiation and is being polite about it. "How did you argue with the sorting hat?" Ron whispered when she sat down. It suggested Ravenclaw, she said. I pointed out that my primary motivation isn't knowledge acquisition, it's using knowledge to change things. That's Gryffindor. Is that true? Harry asked. It is now, she said. Harry was called. He walked to the stool and sat down, and the hat fell over his eyes, and then there was a voice in his ear that was old in a way nothing else was. Old the way the foundations of the castle were old, deeply, quietly made of time old. Well, said the voice, you are something unusual, I've been told. Harry thought back. 3 lordships and a pending, the hat continued. You know what they mean, you intend to use them, a pause, not for yourself, for everyone who needs them, Harry thought. Or for nobody if I can get the systems to change. Either way, the hat was quiet for a moment. Harry had the impression of something very old thinking very quickly. Slytherin would have you in a heartbeat, it said, the ambition, the strategic mind, the willingness to work toward a long goal. But you're not doing this for power, the hat said. You're doing this because it would make you feel physically ill to have what you have and do nothing with it. Another pause. Godric would be insufferably pleased. Gryffindor, the table roared. Harry sat down between Hermione and Ron, and a girl with red hair and a slightly manic expression introduced herself as Ginny Weasley by saying, I told Fred you'd be a Gryffindor, and then looking delighted with herself. Weasley, Harry said. Ron's sister, Ron said, with the tone of a sibling relationship that has achieved equilibrium through extensive conflict. She's not supposed to be here yet, she's only. I snuck in to watch the sorting, Ginny said unrepentantly. Ginny, it's done now, she said. Neville Longbottom landed at Gryffindor with an expression of profound relief. Hermione made room for him and asked him his name and remembered it, which Neville seemed to find remarkable. Harry filed Neville away in the category of people who needed less diminishment and more actual support. He'd read about the Longbottom family too, and the weight Neville carried was a different flavour of heaviness than Harry's own, but recognisable. Dumbledore's welcome speech was warm, broad, inclusive, and almost entirely free of information. Harry listened with the specific attention of someone who has been reading between lines all summer and noted. The headmaster was performatively unworried. Every gesture was calibrated toward this is a normal year. The warmth was genuine. He thought Dumbledore's care for the students was real, but it was the warmth of a man who had decided what this year needed to be and was arranging the furniture accordingly. After the feast, McGonagall appeared at Harry's shoulder with the quiet inevitability of a very well-organized force of nature. Potter, she said. Granger, a word. She took them to a small room off the entrance hall, the kind of room that exists in large old buildings for the sole purpose of conversations that can't happen in corridors. She closed the door. She stood for a moment with her hands clasped. I have been teaching at this school for 37 years, she said. I was here when your parents were students, Potter. I was here before that. I want you to understand that when I say I am glad to see both of you here, I mean it as something more than a pleasantry. Thank you, Professor, Hermione said. I also want you to understand, McGonagall continued, that this school operates under established structures. The headmaster has authority over educational decisions. Staff have authority in their classrooms. Rules exist for good reasons. We understand, Harry said. Good. A pause. I also want you to understand, because I believe you have already found this in your research, that the Founders' Protocols provide a limited but real set of rights to recognized lords of affiliated houses. They have not been invoked in my tenure here. If you have occasion to invoke them, I would ask that you come to me first so that we can handle the process correctly. Harry looked at her. You're not telling us not to use them. I'm telling you to use them correctly, she said. There was something in her voice, not quite approval, but its functional relative. There is a difference between children trying to subvert authority because they find it inconvenient, and young people with legitimate standing exercising that standing responsibly. I will not pretend otherwise. She looked at them both for a moment, this precise, sharp woman who had watched the wizarding world go through its worst years and come out the other side still teaching, still here, still caring about the students who filed through her classroom every September. Get to bed, she said. You have Transfiguration first thing tomorrow, and I have high expectations of both of you. They left. In the corridor, Hermione said quietly, she's going to be our ally. She already is, Harry said. Snape happened on Thursday. Potions was in the dungeons, which were cool and dimly lit, and smelled of ingredients that Harry had spent the summer reading about, which meant he arrived at the first class with the specific pleasure of a person about to see something familiar in a new context. He settled next to Hermione at a workbench and got his textbook out and waited. Snape swept in. Harry had read about Snape too. He was thorough, the summer reading had been thorough, and what he'd found was complicated. A man with a history of intelligence and bitterness and choices made in youth that had calcified into a personality. A man who had been Dumbledore's spy and whose bravery in that role was genuine and significant. A man who had, if the accounts were accurate, made Harry's father's years at school genuinely miserable, and who had been made, in some institutional sense, the instrument of James Potter's son's humiliation in return for his own. The man who walked in matched the description in every surface particular and surprised Harry in one. The intelligence was immediate and visible, burning under everything else like a gas flame, there obvious, powerful, and currently in the service of something other than what it could have been. Potter, Snape said before he'd taken attendance, before he'd said anything to anyone else. He stopped in front of Harry's bench. Our new celebrity. A pause designed for discomfort. Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? The class held its breath. Harry had read his potions textbook. He'd read 3 additional potions texts. He'd specifically read the chapter on sleeping draughts because Hermione had recommended it, and Hermione's recommendations had proven reliable. Draught of living death, Harry said. One of the most powerful sleeping potions known. Asphodel is a type of lily and belongs to the same family as. He paused, and he knew Snape knew he was pausing, and he made the choice to finish the sentence anyway, not as a weapon but as a simple fact. And wormwood's properties intensify compounds made from the lily family. It's why the combination is particularly potent. Silence. Snape's face was doing something complex. The pause lasted long enough for the entire class to register what had happened, which was that the expected humiliation had not occurred. Where would you look? He said, recovering, the voice dropping to its silkiest register. If I asked you to find me a bezoar, stomach of a goat, Harry said. It's an antidote to most poisons. I'd go to a potions supplier rather than an apothecary because the quality control is better. Another silence. Snape looked at him the way people look at something that isn't where they put it. Wolfsbane, he said, and his voice was different now, still dangerous but differently so, complex to brew even for fully qualified potioneers. The most common error is temperature regulation in the 3rd stage, which causes the aconite to lose its efficacy. It's used for werewolves. Snape stepped back. He looked at Harry with an expression that was hostile and controlled, and underneath that, recalibrating with the same speed Harry had seen in Draco on the train. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said, and the words came out like they cost something. Try not to be insufferable about it, Potter. I'll do my best, Harry said. From across the room, Draco Malfoy was watching with an expression that had gone several stages past simple surprise. The class began properly. Harry worked next to Hermione, and their cauldron produced the required result with a precision that Snape examined twice with the air of a man who wanted to find a fault and couldn't. He didn't give them additional points. He didn't take any. He moved past their bench with the measured pace of someone who is deciding how to feel about something. After class in the corridor, Neville said, "Is potions always going to be like that?" "Probably," Harry said. "Snape's clever. He's going to be trickier to deal with than Quirrell." "Who's Quirrell?" Neville asked. "Defense teacher," Ron said. "Bit strange, smells weird." "I want to check the library on that," Hermione said, already walking. "I have a theory." "Of course you do," Ron said, but he was keeping pace with her, and Harry noticed this. The way Ron's complaints about Hermione's research impulses were always accompanied by him doing the research anyway. People were interesting. The castle responded to Harry on the 2nd day. He didn't notice it at first. A staircase that chose to remain stationary when he was running late. A door that opened the first time he pushed rather than sticking, which every other Gryffindor complained about. Rooms that seemed marginally warmer. The portrait of a medieval witch on the 3rd floor who nodded at him each time he passed with the specific gravity of someone acknowledging a person of rank. He noticed it on day 3 when a shortcut appeared in a corridor he'd walked down twice before without any indication that a shortcut existed. He stopped and looked at it and said quietly to the empty corridor, "Thank you." The castle, in the particular way of old magical buildings that have been listening to human lives for 1,000 years, gave the impression of a response without making any sound at all. He told Hermione that evening in the common room. He looked up from her homework and said, "The Founder's protocols include a subsection I haven't fully translated yet, but I think the castle itself is one of the parties to the original magical contracts. You're saying Hogwarts knows who I am. I'm saying Hogwarts may be capable of recognizing bloodline affinities in a way that goes beyond what the sorting hat does." She tapped her quill on the desk. "I want to try something. Come to the library with me on Saturday." "What are we testing?" "Whether the restricted section responds differently to you than it does to other students." She said it the way scientists say, "I have a hypothesis and I intend to test it," which was one of Harry's favorite things about Hermione Granger. "That seems like it might technically be rule-breaking," he said. "We have Founder's protocol standing," she said without looking up. "And I intend to ask Madame Pince first, properly." A pause. "I'm not interested in breaking rules. I'm interested in finding out which rules apply to us and which ones were written before we existed." Friday evening, a letter arrived with the Hogwarts Owls at dinner. 2 letters, actually, both addressed in the same handwriting, precise and adult and unhurried, and Harry recognized it as Dumbledore's. He opened his. Hermione opened hers simultaneously, and they read in the particular parallel silence of 2 people who have gotten used to, over the space of a summer and a week, processing information together. Harry's letter was 3 paragraphs. The first welcomed him to Hogwarts and expressed genuine pleasure at his sorting. The second said that the headmaster would be very glad to sit down with Harry at his convenience to discuss any questions about his circumstances that had arisen over the summer. The third was a single sentence: "I find that direct conversations prevent a great deal of mutual misunderstanding, and I believe you and I may have some to untangle." He looked at Hermione's letter. She was reading the last paragraph, her expression thoughtful. He wants to meet, she said, both of us, apparently. She folded the letter with the neat efficiency she applied to most physical tasks. I think we've made him nervous, not frightened, but she considered. He's used to being the most prepared person in the room. We've been preparing all summer. Do we go? She looked at him over her folded letter. Ron beside her had stopped eating and was watching them both with the expression he'd been wearing all week, which was somewhere between "this is the most interesting thing that's happened to me and I'm not sure what I've got myself into." "Of course we go," she said. "We were always going to have this conversation." "Better to have it on our schedule," Ron said. "Should I be worried?" "No," Harry said. "You both look like you were deciding whether to go to war," Ron said. "We were deciding how to go to a meeting," Hermione said. "With Dumbledore," Ron said. "At age 11. "Yes," Harry said. "Want to come?" Ron picked up his fork. "Obviously," he said. The great hall moved around them, 400 students, and the noise of the living, the food and the laughter and the particular magic of the beginning of a school year when everything still feels possible. Harry looked up at the enchanted ceiling, at the deep autumn sky above the candles, and felt the castle around him, old and intelligent and patient, aware in whatever way old magical things are aware. He was 11. He had arrived here with 3 lordships and a folder of documents, and a list of things that needed addressing and the first real friend he'd ever made. He was about to have dinner in the castle where his parents had fallen in love, in the house founded by his ancestor, surrounded by people who had no idea yet what the next 7 years were going to look like. He was not afraid. Not of Dumbledore's careful warmth, not of Snape's reassembled hostility, not of Lucius Malfoy's name floating at the edges of conversations, not of the thing in Albania that his Peveril documents had tracked a cold hillside and a host who didn't know what was growing in him. He had a lot of work to do. He was looking forward to it. Chapter 3, Old Magic, New Hands. The meeting with Dumbledore happened on a Sunday. Harry and Hermione had agreed on Saturday night, in the common room after Ron had gone to bed, that they would go in with 3 objectives. Establish what Dumbledore knew about the Philosopher's Stone, because it was in the school. Harry was almost certain of it. The security measures in the forbidden corridor on the 3rd floor were obvious enough that a careful first year with a summer's worth of research behind them could connect the dots, find out what he intended to do about Voldemort's continued existence, and make clear without hostility that they were not pieces to be positioned. "We're not going in accusatory," Harry said. "Agreed. He's not the enemy, but we're not going in deferential either." "Obviously not," Hermione said with the expression of someone for whom deference had always been a strategic tool rather than a natural posture. They climbed to the 7th floor in the early Sunday morning quiet, the castle making its usual small accommodations. The gargoyle on the 6th floor landing shifted to let them pass without the usual half-hearted lunge, and knocked on the door of the headmaster's office. "Come in," said Dumbledore's voice. The office was exactly what it should have been, which was the first thing Harry noticed. It was the office of a man who wanted you to be impressed, arranged with enough genuine wonder that the performance didn't feel like performance. Instruments that Harry recognized from his research, sneakoscopes, dolometers, something that might have been a modified time-keeping device of enormous complexity, covered every available surface. Portraits of former headmasters lined the walls, most of them awake and watching with the undisguised curiosity of people who had been asleep for months and had woken to find something interesting happening. Fawkes was on his perch. He turned his head when Harry entered and made a sound that was halfway between a trill and a question. Harry looked at the Phoenix. The Phoenix looked at Harry. There was a moment that felt distinctly mutual. Dumbledore sat behind his desk in deep purple robes, his half-moon glasses on the end of his nose, and he looked at them with an expression of warm, genuine interest that Harry had been reading and rereading all week in the tone of his letter. The warmth was real, the interest was real, and underneath both of those real things was something else, the same quality he'd heard under the letter's surface, the alertness of a man recalibrating. "Harry," he said, "Miss Granger, please sit down." They sat. Ron had elected to wait outside on the grounds that the conversation would be more productive without a third party who had no formal standing, and Harry had thought this was probably the most politically astute thing Ron had said so far, which he'd told him, and Ron had looked both pleased and mildly offended. "I imagine," Dumbledore said, "that you have questions." "A few," Harry said. "Then let us begin there. I find that questions are more efficient than prepared statements in most conversations." His eyes were bright behind the glasses, attentive, and Harry thought relieved in some small way to be having this conversation directly. "Ask what you like." Harry asked about the unauthorized withdrawal first. Dumbledore's expression didn't change in any visible way, but the quality of stillness in the room shifted. He folded his hands on the desk and said, "The money was used to establish the conditions of your placement with your aunt and uncle, and to provide certain protections around number 4 Privet Drive. Blood wards primarily. The guardianship authority I used to access the funds was, I will acknowledge, operating at the edge of its legal legitimacy by the time the transaction was made." "It had already expired," Harry said. "By some interpretations," Dumbledore said, which was the response of a man who was not going to concede the full point but was acknowledging the argument's existence. "What interpretations make it valid?" Hermione asked. She had her notebook open and her quill in her hand, which Harry suspected was both functional and a subtle signal. This conversation is being documented. Dumbledore looked at the notebook with the brief appreciation of a chess player who has seen an unexpected move. Under the emergency guardianship provisions of 1689, protections made in the immediate aftermath of a declared magical emergency retain their authority for a period sufficient to establish the child's long-term safety, regardless of the formal expiry of the guardianship instrument. A pause. I was operating under those provisions. They are genuinely contested in their interpretation. I will not pretend otherwise. You could have asked, Harry said, not angry, just noting the fact. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. You were 14 months old, he said quietly. There was nobody to ask. That landed. Harry let it. He thought about 14 months old and 2 dead parents and a man who had been holding the entire wizarding world together by main force, trying to make one more decision on too little sleep with too little time. He didn't forgive it exactly, but he understood it, and understanding it meant he could put it down and pick up the next thing. The Philosopher's Stone, he said. The room went very still. Dumbledore looked at him without surprise, which was itself informative. He said, what makes you think? The 3rd-floor corridor, Harry said. You warned us away from it on our first night. The warning was specific enough to be genuine, but vague enough to pique curiosity in anyone paying attention. Nicholas Flamel's published work on alchemical permanence includes a notation in the 1987 appendix about secure storage of the primary catalyst. And the security measures I can hear from the corridor, yes, I can hear the dog, are significant enough for something real. He paused. You want it protected? I think it's here because you trust Hogwarts more than any other location, which means you're worried. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. It was still warm, but the performance layer was gone, and what was left was something more like the voice of a man talking to someone he was genuinely uncertain about in the best possible way. Someone is attempting to steal it, he said. I have some sense of who and why and what the consequences of success would be. Voldemort, Hermione said. The portraits on the walls reacted, rustling, murmuring. Dumbledore looked at Hermione with the particular expression he wore. Harry was coming to understand when someone impressed him. You are comfortable with the name, he observed. Names don't hurt you unless you let them, she said. Voldemort is not fully gone. Harry's Peverell inheritance documents include a tracking notation on the resurrection stone that placed a life signature in Albania as of 2 years ago. Something is alive there. I believe it is a fragment of Voldemort's soul, separated from the main portion during the rebounding killing curse, and I believe that separation was possible because he had already fragmented his soul before he came to Godric's Hollow. The room was very still. Dumbledore was looking at Hermione with an expression that was several things at once, complex in the way of emotions that have been held private for a long time suddenly recognizing themselves in someone else's words. After a long pause he said, that is a conclusion I reached some years ago. I have not shared it widely. We found it independently, Harry said. You should know that the Peverell instruments will update us if the tracking notation changes. If whatever is in Albania moves, we'll know. I see, Dumbledore said, and he said it the way a man says something when he's actually seeing several things simultaneously. He looked between them, this ancient man with his half-moon glasses and his long, careful life, and Harry thought he could actually see the moment when Dumbledore stopped thinking of them as children to be managed and started thinking of them as something that required a different category. Not equals quite, but not pieces on a board either. What do you want from this conversation? Dumbledore asked. To know that you're not relying on passive protection, Harry said. The stone is bait, isn't it? Not just protection, you're waiting for whoever's helping Voldemort to make a move so you can identify them. A pause. Among other considerations, the trap has a flaw, Harry said. A person desperate enough and clever enough will get through the protections regardless. If that person has Voldemort in them, the outcome is worse than a simple theft. And your suggestion? We're not suggesting anything yet, Hermione said. We're telling you we know and that we're going to be paying attention, and that if we see something moving toward that corridor that shouldn't be, we'll act. She met Dumbledore's eyes. We wanted you to know in advance, as a courtesy. Another silence. Fawkes made a soft sound from his perch. Dumbledore said, You are remarkably like your parents, Harry, both of them. A pause. That is meant as the highest compliment I know how to give. I'll find out if it is, Harry said. Once I know more about them, there are some gaps in my history that I'd like to fill. I will have Minerva coordinate a meeting, Dumbledore said, and this time it was a genuine offer, unguarded. She knew them well, better than I did, in the ways that matter for the history you're looking for. They stood. At the door, Hermione turned back and said, The stone isn't the only concern. If Voldemort's soul fragment moves and acquires a body, the timeline for everything changes. I want to be in communication about that, not informed after the fact, in communication. Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I find I agree with you, Miss Granger. That is not a sentence I expected to say to a first-year student, and I mean it without condescension. Good, she said. I find condescension counterproductive. They left. Ron was waiting on the landing, eating a biscuit he'd obtained from somewhere, and looked up when they came out. How'd it go? Well, Harry said. He's going to tell McGonagall we're a problem, Hermione said. Is that bad? No, Harry said. McGonagall will tell him we're an asset. There's a difference. Ron considered this. I really did just sign up for all of this by sitting in your compartment, didn't I? Completely voluntarily, Harry confirmed. Ron thought about it, then he grinned. All right, he said, what do we do next? What they did next was charms, which was taught by Flitwick, who was 4.5 feet tall, stood on a pile of books to see over his desk, and was the single most technically gifted teacher Harry had encountered in his 3 weeks at Hogwarts. He taught charms the way a musician plays, with an ease that was actually complete mastery, so thoroughly absorbed it looked simple, and he pushed his students with genuine enthusiasm rather than expectation of failure. He also, on the 3rd week, asked Harry to demonstrate the levitation charm for the class. Harry had been practicing since the 2nd day of term. The levitation charm was in the 1st chapter of the Standard Book of Spells. He'd got it on his 4th try in the dormitory on a Wednesday night, with Ron watching and eating crisps and offering moral support. But he'd been working past it, running ahead the way that felt natural when you'd spent a summer immersed in theory, before ever picking up a wand for formal instruction. He stood and pointed his wand at the feather on his desk and said Wingardium Leviosa, and the feather went up cleanly. And then, because Flitwick had asked for a demonstration and Harry didn't see the point in doing things halfway, he directed it in a smooth arc around the room and settled it back on his desk with precise control. The class applauded, which was slightly embarrassing. Exceptional, Flitwick said, beaming from his book stack. The lateral control on the arc, that's not technique they'll cover until 3rd year, Mr. Potter. How did you develop that? Reading about the theory first, Harry said. I understood what the charm was doing before I tried to do it. It made the doing easier. Yes, that's exactly right, Flitwick said with the delight of a teacher whose pet theory has just been validated by a student. Theory informs practice. Too many students skip to the wand work and wonder why they plateau. He looked at Hermione. Miss Granger, if you'd like to show us yours. Hermione's feather went up and stayed up with the rigidity of something held by absolute certainty. Then she too began to experiment small adjustments, testing the limits the way she did everything, and hers had a precision that Harry's had slightly less of. His was more fluid, hers was more controlled. Flitwick looked between them with the expression of a man who has just identified 2 students he is going to enjoy teaching enormously. After class, walking down the corridor toward lunch, Neville said quietly to Harry, I can't get it to move. You will, Harry said. It's easy for you. Harry stopped walking. Neville stopped too, looking uncomfortable, as if he expected to be told off for saying the true thing. It's not easy, Harry said. It was easier once I understood the theory. Do you want to work on it tonight? I can walk you through how I thought about it before I tried. Neville looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has been offered genuine help and is not sure if it's real. You do that? Yeah, Harry said. Hermione's better at explaining theory than I am, though. She'll come too. I'll come, Hermione confirmed from slightly ahead of them without looking back. Neville looked like he'd been offered something that was more than the thing that had been offered, which Harry understood. What he was actually being offered was the idea that difficulty wasn't permanent, which was a thing nobody had made clear to Neville in a while. The restriction section of the library opened for Harry on the 3rd Saturday of term, not dramatically, not with a magical fanfare. Madame Pince had looked at the Founder's Protocol documentation Harry and Hermione had brought. Hermione had had copies made and properly cross-referenced, and she'd said, I'll need to verify this with the headmaster, and 2 days later she'd said, your access is confirmed. No removing texts without a loan notation, no spells cast on the texts, no food. The last condition delivered with the tone of someone who has been betrayed by food before and has not recovered from it. The restricted section smelled different from the rest of the library, older, more layered, the smell of knowledge that had been accumulated rather than organized. Some of the books shifted when he walked past them. One very old volume tried to bite Hermione, who shut it firmly and put it back with the expression of someone who has dealt with worse. They were looking for information on Horcruxes. Harry had found the word in the Peverell inheritance documents, buried in a subsection about the Resurrection Stone's history, a single reference to the stone having been used in the creation of what the text called a soul vessel of the most degraded kind. He traced it from there through 3 other obscure texts over the summer without finding a definition. And then Hermione had found the definition in the 4th week of term, in a book called Magic Most Evil, that Madame Pince had given them the same look for requesting, as she might have given someone asking for directions to a crime scene. The definition was worse than Harry had expected. They sat at a table in the corner of the restricted section and read it together, which they'd taken to doing when something was important, physically reading the same text, not summarizing for each other because they'd found that they caught different things. A Horcrux was a container for a fragment of a soul, split from the main soul by an act of murder, and anchored in an object by a specific dark ritual. The purpose was immortality of a degraded specific kind. You could not be killed while the fragment persisted, but you could be destroyed, reduced, diminished, forced into a non-corporeal existence. The soul fragments themselves were described as malignant remnants, carrying the intent and essence of the Creator in concentrated and corrupted form. More than one, Hermione said quietly after they'd both finished. If the soul can be split, it can be split more than once. That's what I was thinking, Harry said. The Albania tracking notation on the resurrection stone isn't tracking the stone, it's tracking a Horcrux. She was very still, the way she got when something significant had finished assembling itself in her mind. He made multiple Horcruxes, which means the resurrection ritual, someone trying to restore him to a body, even if they succeeded, they'd only be restoring a fragment. The rest are still out there, still anchored, still functional as anchors. Can't fully die until they're all destroyed, Harry said. And Dumbledore knows this, she said. He knows it, that's why he's not simply pursuing the thing in Albania, because even if it's eliminated, the Horcruxes persist. And destroying them first requires finding them, which requires information about what Voldemort might have chosen and when, and she stopped. Harry said, we need that information. Yes, she looked at him. We also need to tell Dumbledore that we know this word. He's been very careful not to say it to anyone. We should let him know we've found it independently before he discovers we've been reading in this direction. Agreed. Harry closed the book. He sat for a moment in the particular quality of silence that follows understanding something you'd rather not have understood. Hermione. Yes, Voldemort came to Godric's Hollow after my parents. He was there specifically for me. He said it the way you say a thing you've been building toward all morning. The Peveril documents track the killing curse rebounding as an event of profound magical singularity, their words. That doesn't happen from a standard defense. My mother did something. A sacrifice, Hermione said. She'd found this in the blood magic text she'd been reading for the past 2 weeks. Willing self-sacrifice for love creates a protection that can persist in the blood of the protected person. It's one of the oldest forms of magic. It predates virtually everything we study. So when the curse rebounded, it hit a protection that was already there, which means he wasn't just defeated by bad luck. She looked at him directly. Your mother chose it. She could have run. She chose to stay. That's the magic. Harry looked at the table for a moment. He thought about Lily Potter, whom he'd never known, and the decision she'd made, and the 11 years of consequences that had flowed from it. He thought about love as a mechanism in ancient magic, which was the kind of thing that sounded sentimental until you understood what it actually meant, that the intention behind an act changed its magical properties, that self-sacrifice carried a different charge than anything cast deliberately, that it was in some ways the most powerful thing in their entire field of study, and also the thing least discussed in academic texts because it was hardest to quantify. She was brilliant, he said. Yes, Hermione said, she was. They sat quietly for a moment with that, and then Harry straightened up and said, right, what else do we need to find before term ends? Defense against the dark arts under Quirrell was a problem Harry had been watching since the second lesson. The stutter was performed. This had taken him until the end of week 2 to confirm because Quirrell was actually quite good at the performance. It was consistent, it had internal logic, it never broke. But there was a quality underneath it that Harry's new instinct for people reading, sharpened by a summer of research and a month of navigating institutional politics, flagged as wrong. Quirrell's fear was real, but it wasn't the nerves of a stammering academic. It was the fear of a man doing something that frightened him. The turban was the other thing. It was always present. No reason was given. And it smelled, when you were close enough, of garlic, which was not, Harry had checked, a known component of any legitimate protective enchantment currently in academic use. He told Hermione on a Tuesday evening, and she put down her quill and said, I've been wondering about the turban since week 1. What do you think? She was quiet for a moment, running through her internal catalogue with the speed that still occasionally surprised him. Possession is the most obvious explanation for the behavioral inconsistencies, but full possession of a competent adult wizard should show more magical blade. There should be incidents, accidental magic fluctuations. We haven't seen those. She paused. Unless the host is cooperating. Willing possession, Harry said, or partial, something riding along rather than driving, something that needs the host functional. She looked at the table. If it's a Horcrux or a remnant with enough will to direct itself, it might be capable of partial incorporation without full control. The turban, Harry said. Yes, she said, the turban. They looked at each other across the library table with the specific expression of two people who have just confirmed something they'd hoped was wrong. Dumbledore is watching him, Harry said. He must be. Probably. But if Quirrell is the trap mechanism, she stopped, and Harry followed the thought to its end, and the end was, if Quirrell was meant to move when the time was right and trigger the trap, then the trap required Quirrell to get close to the stone, which meant the protections were designed to be passable by someone with Quirrell's abilities, which meant the trap could be sprung earlier than intended if the rider on Quirrell's turban decided to stop waiting. We need to know what's on the other side of that corridor, Harry said. We will, Hermione said, but not yet, not without more information. She picked up her quill again. I want to know every protection between the corridor door and the stone before we go anywhere near it, which means research first. How? I'll ask Flitwick about charms-based protections in general terms. I can get information about transfiguration applications from McGonagall's published texts. Snape's research on potions-based protections is in the library, 2 papers from the 1980s. She was writing as she spoke, building the research map in real time. It's going to take a few weeks. That's fine, Harry said. We have until, he paused, calculating. Whenever Quirrell decides to move, then we work faster than Quirrell, she said. Snape found them in the library on a Thursday. Harry and Hermione had a regular Thursday evening session, research, homework, the ongoing deconstruction of wizarding lore that Hermione was pursuing with the thoroughness of someone who intended to change it, and Snape appeared at the end of their table with the particular quality of silence that very controlled people achieve when they move without making noise. "Potter," he said. "Granger." He put something on the table between them. It was a small book, old, with a worn cover. "The texts you've been requesting on potions-based protections are all partial. That is the complete version." He paused. "I am lending it, not giving it. I expect it back in its current condition." Harry looked at the book. He looked at Snape. Why? Snape looked at him with the expression of a man who objects to the directness of the question but can't fault it. "Because you are clearly researching something specific and the resources available to you in the general collection are insufficient. Because incomplete research is more dangerous than no research." A pause, longer this time. "And because you asked a correct question about wolfsbane in my first class and I have been considering the appropriate response for 3 weeks. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't warmth, but it was something, a gesture from a man who made very few in the direction of 2 students he had expected to find annoying and was finding, against his clear preference, interesting." "Thank you, Professor," Hermione said with the precise calibration of someone who knows how to accept a difficult thing gracefully. She pulled the book toward her. Snape looked like he was going to leave and then didn't. He said, his voice at its most controlled and therefore most carefully stripped of whatever he didn't want in it. "Your mother was gifted at potions, Potter, considerably more so than your father. It would be a waste not to inherit that." Harry said nothing for a moment. "Then I'd like to know more about her if you're willing, not now but sometime." Snape's face did something extremely private and then didn't. "That," he said, "is a conversation for a different time." He turned and left without another word. Ron, who had arrived at the table during the last 30 seconds and had been frozen in place with an armful of books, waited until Snape was out of sight. "What was that?" "Progress," Harry said. "Snape gave you a book." "It's a loan," Hermione said, already reading it. "Snape loaned you a book." Ron sat down heavily. "Harry, what is happening?" "I'll explain later," Harry said. "What did Flitwick say about the charm sequences?" Ron had been their liaison for the charms research. He'd been spending extra time with Flitwick on general charm theory, which had the double benefit of being academically genuine and providing cover for the specific questions, and he pulled out his notes with the air of a person who has discovered that he's quite good at something he didn't know he was good at. 7 layered charms minimum," he said, reading his notes. Flitwick said high-level charms security uses a sequence that requires correctly untangling each layer before the next one becomes visible. He was talking theoretically, but the numbers match the corridor. "Oh, and there's a logic-based component." He mentioned it in the context of a historical vault protection from about the right time period. "That's the bottleneck," Hermione said, not looking up from Snape's book. "Logic puzzles have only one correct sequence. They're immune to magical forcing." "Can you solve them?" Harry asked. She looked up at him over the book with a very particular expression. "Harry," she said. "Right," he said. "Sorry, stupid question." Neville, across the table, looked up from his transfiguration homework. He'd been present for 3 of these Thursday sessions now, initially by accident and then by standing invitation, and he had the slightly dazed expression of someone watching a Quidditch match from very close proximity. "Are you two planning something that I should know about?" "Probably," Harry said. "We'll tell you when it's relevant." "Will I need to do anything brave?" "Maybe," Harry said. Neville looked back at his transfiguration homework. "All right," he said with the tone of someone who has made peace with a thing. "Give me some notice." The library settled around them. The candles burned down. Hermione read Snape's book and made notes in a code Harry had already broken. She didn't know he'd broken it. He hadn't mentioned it. It seemed the kind of thing she'd be both pleased and slightly annoyed about. And Ron refined his charm sequence notes, and Neville worked his way steadily through a transfiguration problem that had been defeating him. And Harry drafted the letter he intended to send Gringotts the following week about the formal inquiry into Sirius Black's trial records, which he'd been building toward for 2 months. It was, he thought, a good Thursday. Outside the castle windows, autumn had fully arrived, pressing red and gold against the glass. The lake was dark. The forbidden forest was darker. Somewhere in the school a dog was sleeping across a trapdoor, and beneath the trapdoor a sequence of protections waited, and in the turban of a frightened man something patient and cold was doing its own slow mathematics. Harry added a footnote to his Gringotts letter and went back to his research. There was a lot of work left to do, and he had learned over the last 3 months that work done well and in advance was the most powerful thing in his considerable arsenal. More powerful than the lordships, more powerful than the castle's affection, more powerful than being the boy who had survived something extraordinary at 14 months old. He wasn't going to wait for things to happen to him. He was going to happen to them first. Chapter 4, The Politics of Blood. The troll came on Halloween. Harry smelled it before he heard it, a wave of rot and something fungal, moving through the corridor outside the great hall with the particular wrongness of a large creature that should not be inside a building. He was at the Gryffindor table between Ron and Neville when Quirrell burst through the doors and delivered his warning in a performance so theatrical that Harry's first thought was, "This is a distraction," followed immediately by, "Where is Hermione?" She wasn't at the table. He was moving before Quirrell finished his fainting act. Ron caught it too. Ron was quicker than people gave him credit for, and they were both in the corridor before the prefects had started organizing the Gryffindor evacuation properly. Harry cast a quick lumos as they cleared the hall doors and said, "She went to the bathroom after dinner, second floor. That's where Lavender said she'd been crying," Ron said, keeping pace beside him. "She wasn't crying," Harry said with certainty, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "She was doing her thing where she goes somewhere quiet to process something. Lavender probably said something. Lavender did say something about her being a know-it-all. I know." The second floor corridor had a different quality of smell, stronger, closer, the troll's presence pressing against the stone walls. They rounded the corner and saw it at the far end, 12 feet of grey bulk, moving with the specific purposefulness of something that had smelled something interesting and was following the smell toward the girl's bathroom. The bathroom door was already closed. Harry ran. He wasn't calculating. There was no version of this where he calculated and came out at a different answer, because the answer was always get to the door before the troll does, and he got there with 3 seconds to spare, planting himself between the troll and the door with his wand out and the particular quality of focus that came from a sum of theory meeting its first real application. "Ron," he said. "Yeah," Ron said, already at his shoulder. The troll turned. It was bigger than Harry had imagined from the descriptions in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, which was the failure of text. 12 feet and a club the size of a small tree, grey skin with the texture of old stone, small eyes that registered them with the blank interest of something that has identified a moving thing and is now deciding whether to eat it. Harry cast Wingardium Leviosa on the club, not at the feather-lifting level from Charms class. He pushed, the way he'd been quietly pushing at the limits of his magic since September, past the controlled arc around Flitwick's classroom, past the dormitory practice, past the point where the spell stopped being a first-year exercise and became something else. The club ripped out of the troll's hand with a crack of displaced air and went to the ceiling 14 feet up and stayed there. The troll looked at its empty hand. It looked up. It looked at Harry with what was, for a troll, an expression of unprecedented intellectual complication. Harry moved it. The club swung from the ceiling in a controlled arc and came down across the back of the troll's head with the force of something 14 feet up using gravity as a collaborator. The sound it made was enormous and specific, the sound of a very large thing going down. The troll went down. The silence afterward was significant. The bathroom door opened. Hermione stood in the doorway holding her wand, her expression tracking through relief and adrenaline and a third thing that Harry identified as the face of someone who had been inside the bathroom fully intending to handle the situation herself and was currently recalibrating how she felt about having been beaten to it. "I had a plan," she said. "What was it?" Harry asked. "Reducto on the pipes, flood the floor, compromise its footing, then Wingardium Leviosa on the club." She looked at the fallen troll. "You used the same final step, same principle, faster execution." He lowered his wand. His heart was doing something irregular and loud, which was apparently what happened after you hit a 12-foot troll with its own club, but his voice came out level. "Are you all right?" "Yes." She stepped over the troll's outstretched hand, which was the size of a bin lid. "Ron." "Brilliant," Ron said from slightly behind Harry in the voice of someone who has just watched something and is still catching up to the reality of it. "That was Harry. How hard did you hit it?" "Hard enough," Harry said. "We need to be here when the teachers arrive. Don't move anything." They were in exactly that position, Harry, Hermione and Ron standing calmly in a corridor next to an unconscious troll, when McGonagall arrived 40 seconds later, followed closely by Snape and Quirrell. McGonagall took in the scene with the rapid, precise assessment of a woman who has been processing impossible situations for 37 years, and her expression moved through several stages before settling on something that was outwardly stern and inwardly something more complicated. Snape examined the troll. He walked around it twice. He looked at the ceiling and the dent where the club had impacted and then at Harry. "The levitation charm," he said, without any of his usual tonal architecture. "Just the fact." "Yes," Harry said. "The force required to remove that club from the troll's grip would require—" Snape paused. "I know," Harry said. Quirrell was staring at the troll with an expression that Harry clocked now with new precision. It was not the shocked horror of a defense teacher confronting a dangerous creature that had gotten further into the school than it should have. It was the expression of someone watching a plan go differently than planned. McGonagall said, 5 points to each of you. And 10 points to Gryffindor for presence of mind. She said this last part as though she were grading it against an internal rubric, and had decided it was worth more than she was awarding but couldn't justify giving a first-year 50 points for knocking out a troll. "You will, however, explain to me later how you came to be in this corridor instead of your dormitory." "We came to find Hermione," Harry said. "She wasn't at the table when the warning was given." McGonagall looked at Hermione. "You were in the bathroom." "Yes, Professor," Hermione said. She said nothing else. McGonagall, who was the kind of woman who understood that sometimes the reason a girl was crying in a bathroom was best left unexamined in a public corridor, made a note of the point and let it go. Quirrell said faintly, I see, can't imagine how it got in." "Quite," said Snape in a tone that functioned as a scalpel, and Quirrell went quiet. The aftermath of the troll was public in a way Harry hadn't fully anticipated. By breakfast the next morning the story had moved through the school in the manner of all school stories, growing in the transit, acquiring details that hadn't existed, losing details that had, until the versions circulating in the upper years involved Harry having physically fought the troll and won, which wasn't accurate but was less wrong than some versions. A Ravenclaw fifth year stopped him in the corridor and said, "Is it true you threw the troll through a wall?" And Harry said no and kept walking. The owls came on the second day after, not personal owls, official ones, 3 letters bearing ministry seals and 2 bearing the seals of Wisengamot families. Harry opened them at breakfast with Ron watching over his shoulder and Hermione reading her own copies at the same time because 2 of the letters had been sent to both of them. The first was from the Department of Magical Creatures, a formal notice that the troll's presence in Hogwarts had triggered an investigation into security procedures, and that the investigation would include testimony from students present during the incident. The second, from Lucius Malfoy, was addressed to Harry personally. It was beautifully written and completely empty of genuine content, all surface courtesy and carefully positioned concern about student safety and the adequacy of current headmaster leadership, but its purpose was visible in the 3rd paragraph, where Malfoy noted that as a member of the Hogwarts Board of Governors, he was naturally very concerned about the events of Halloween and would be requesting a formal board review. Harry read it twice. He handed it to Hermione. She read it in 30 seconds and handed it back. "He's using the troll as an entry point," she said quietly under the noise of breakfast. "He wants to undermine Dumbledore's authority over the school. If he can establish negligence, he gains influence over the board's response," Harry said, "and through the board over school policy." He looked at the letter. "He's not wrong that there's a legitimate safety question. The troll got in, that's a real failure." "But that's not what this letter is about," she said. "No, this letter is about Lucius Malfoy deciding that the events of Halloween are an opportunity." He set the letter down. "I need to think about this." "Think faster," Hermione said. "He'll move quickly." Ron was looking between them with the expression he'd been wearing with increasing frequency, which was somewhere between admiration and the mild vertigo of a person who has found himself adjacent to things that are significantly larger than he'd signed up for. "What do you do with a letter from Lucius Malfoy?" "You answer it," Harry said, "carefully, and you make sure you do it before he makes his first move." Harry wrote 3 letters that evening. The first was to Lucius Malfoy, brief, courteous, and constructed with the care of someone who had spent a summer reading wizarding legal texts. He acknowledged Malfoy's concerns, agreed that the security failure was legitimate grounds for inquiry, and noted that as Lord Potter and heir to House Black, he had standing to submit a formal statement to any board inquiry. He said he looked forward to ensuring the inquiry was conducted thoroughly and that all relevant factors were considered. He did not say which factors. He left Malfoy to wonder. The second was to Amelia Bones at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, not through any formal Bones inheritance channel which would have been heavy-handed, but as a concerned student with standing, referencing the ministry investigation notice and politely offering testimony. He had never met Amelia Bones, but her reputation was in everything he'd read about the ministry, and it was the reputation of a woman who was scrupulously fair and quietly formidable, and he thought those were the right qualities for what was coming. The third was to Gringotts, referencing the formal inquiry he'd filed 2 weeks ago about Sirius Black's trial records and asking whether the inquiry had progressed. He'd been sending a version of this letter every 2 weeks since September. He was going to keep sending it. Hermione read all 3 before he sent them. She suggested 2 changes to the Malfoy letter, a structural adjustment in the 2nd paragraph that made the implication about the black heir standing slightly more visible, and a softening of a phrase in the closing that she said read as threatening and should read as neutral. He made both changes. They were better. "The Bones letter is good," she said. "She'll respect the directness." "What about the Gringotts letter?" "The Gringotts letter is fine. Ragnarok knows what you're doing. At this point you're just keeping the file active." She handed the letters back. "Send them tonight." He did. He used 3 different owls, which he'd learned was better than using Hedwig for everything. Official correspondence arriving on a Hogwarts school owl looked different from correspondence arriving on a distinctive snowy owl, and appearances mattered in a world that was as much about performance as substance. Lucius Malfoy arrived at Hogwarts on a Thursday. Harry found out because Draco mentioned it, not directly, but in the way Draco had developed over the past 2 months of dropping information into proximity without appearing to give it directly. They'd been in a strange equilibrium since the train, not friends, not enemies, something hovering between them that hadn't resolved yet. Draco sat near them in potions and occasionally directed comments at Harry that were ostensibly barbs but functioned more like tests, probing for the response that would tell him where the boundaries were. Harry had decided early on that the most interesting thing about Draco Malfoy was not what he said, but what he chose not to say, and the gap between those 2 things was growing. On Wednesday, Draco said in the corridor outside potions, "My father's coming to the school tomorrow," and looked at Harry with the particular attention of someone dropping a stone into water to see how far the ripples go. "I heard there's a board visit," Harry said. He's been talking to people on the board, a lot of people. A pause. He's not talking about the troll anymore. What's he talking about? Draco's expression did the thing Harry had come to recognize, the brief internal negotiation between what he'd been trained to present and what he was actually thinking. The reading, he said finally. The inheritance changes. He thinks Dumbledore arranged them somehow to shift power away from old families. Dumbledore didn't arrange them, Harry said. Gringotts triggered them automatically on our 11th birthdays. Goblin inheritance law, not wizard politics. I know that, Draco said, and he did. Harry could hear it in the flatness of his voice, the knowledge that the explanation he'd been given didn't hold up. My father doesn't find that explanation satisfying. What explanation would he find satisfying? Draco looked at him. One where people like you and Granger don't have what you have, he said, and there was something raw in it, underneath the careful Malfoy surface, not cruelty but fear, the fear of a boy who had been told his family's standing was the architecture of his world and was watching that architecture develop cracks. Harry said, your family's standing doesn't depend on mine, you know that. My father doesn't. Your father's wrong, Harry said, not unkindly, just true. Draco looked at him for a long moment and didn't say anything else, which was, Harry was coming to understand, Draco's version of a significant response. Lucius Malfoy was everything the letter had suggested, and more tall, composed, dressed with the effortful understatedness of someone whose clothing cost more than most people's furniture, his white blonde hair and pale eyes giving him the look of something that had been beautiful a long time and knew it. He arrived in Dumbledore's entrance hall with 2 other board members, and the bearing of a man who had decided in advance how this visit was going to go. Harry was in the entrance hall because he'd arranged to be. He'd asked McGonagall the previous day about the Founder's protocol provisions for board visits, specifically whether a recognized lord of a Hogwarts-affiliated house had the right to be present for formal board proceedings that concerned the school, and McGonagall had said after a pause that contained a significant amount of thought, that is a reasonable interpretation of the protocol. I would advise you to be present only and not to speak unless directly addressed. Of course, Harry had said. McGonagall had looked at him, and Miss Granger will also be exercising her protocol rights. She has Selwyn standing. The Selwyn cadet connection has Hogwarts historical ties. I see, McGonagall had said, and written something in her notebook with the particular precision of someone documenting a situation they believe will need documented. So Harry and Hermione stood in the entrance hall as Lucius Malfoy arrived, not in his way, not making a scene, simply present in the specific manner of people who have standing to be present. Dumbledore was there too, and McGonagall and 2 other teachers. Dumbledore's expression when he saw Harry and Hermione was, Harry thought, one of his more genuinely surprised expressions, the performance only slightly deployed. Lucius Malfoy noticed them immediately. His eyes found Harry and held, and something moved in his pale gaze, assessment, recalculation, and then his expression arranged itself into the smooth pleasantness of a man who has decided to treat the board as his home territory. Lord Potter, he said, inclining his head in the minimal acknowledgement that one lord technically owed another. I wasn't aware you'd be joining us. I have protocol standing, Harry said pleasantly. It seemed like the right thing to do, and Miss Granger. The pleasantness with Hermione was thinner. It had the specific quality of an adjustment being made in real time. A Muggle-born with Selwyn standing is an unusual circumstance. Unusual but legal, Hermione said, with the tone of someone who has researched this particular point until it's airtight. I have the Gringotts documentation if the board would like to see it. One of the other board members, a stout witch Harry recognized from his research as Griselda Marchbanks, who ran wizarding examinations but also sat on the board, looked at Hermione with what Harry thought was genuine interest. You carry your inheritance documentation with you, she said. At board-level meetings, yes, Hermione said. Marchbanks made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She looked at Lucius Malfoy with the expression of a woman who has sat on committees with him for years and is currently enjoying his day significantly. The board meeting happened in a conference room off the main corridor. Harry and Hermione sat to one side as observers, which was their protocol right, present, documented, but not at the table. They listened. Lucius Malfoy made his case with the fluid confidence of a man who prepared his arguments the way other men chose their clothes. For effect, for impression, each point deployed at the optimal moment. The troll was the opening, a genuine failure of security, he said, that raised questions about the adequacy of current leadership. He moved through 2 more specific incidents. A charm malfunction in the defense classroom that Harry knew had been genuine accident, a potions ingredient storage issue that Hermione had actually raised herself through proper channels, and built toward his conclusion, which was that the board should consider appointing a special oversight role for the school's daily management, which would incidentally be filled by someone Lucius Malfoy recommended. Dumbledore responded to each point with the measured ease of a man who had been in rooms like this for 60 years and had found a way to be simultaneously deferential and immovable. He acknowledged the troll incident as a genuine concern. He outlined the security improvements already implemented. He was gracious and specific and gave away nothing. It was, Harry thought, an excellent performance by both sides. Marchbanks said, the security failure is noted and addressed. The proposed oversight role raises questions about board authority under the Hogwarts Foundation Charter. She looked at her notes. The charter is very specific about the headmaster's autonomy in daily operations. The charter, Lucius Malfoy said, dates from a period when the current challenges could not have been anticipated. The charter, Harry said from his side of the room in the measured tone he'd been practicing all week, also specifies that modifications to headmaster authority require a 2/3 majority of the full board, which I believe is 13 members. I count 3 present. He paused. I don't mean to interrupt, I'm noting a procedural point. Everyone in the room looked at him. Lucius Malfoy looked at him with the specific quality of a man who has just recognized that he has made an error in a game he thought he was winning. Procedural points are welcome, Marchbanks said, and she was definitely trying not to smile. The Charter's amendment provisions, Harry continued, because he was in it now and the research was there and he wasn't going to leave it half-said, were established with a supermajority requirement specifically to prevent minority interests from using board mechanisms to override educational leadership decisions. The provision was introduced in 1612, following an attempt by 3 board members to remove the headmaster, for the language in the original is quite detailed, for teaching students from families that certain interests found commercially inconvenient. He looked at Lucius Malfoy without hostility. I think the historical parallel is worth noting. Silence. Dumbledore at the table had an expression that was the closest Harry had yet seen to genuine delight, kept almost entirely behind his usual serenity, showing only in the very corners of his eyes. Lucius Malfoy said, You've done your reading, Lord Potter. I had a useful summer, Harry said. They looked at each other across the conference room, the boy with 3 lordships and a folder of documents, and the man with decades of institutional power and a philosophy built on the idea that blood determined worth, and the quality of that look was something that everyone in the room registered without being able to fully articulate. It was the look of 2 people who have identified each other as forces to be reckoned with, and are deciding on the terms of their reckoning. Lucius Malfoy inclined his head, not a concession, an acknowledgement. Another time, he said. I look forward to it, Harry said. After the board members left, McGonagall found Harry and Hermione in the entrance hall and stood with them for a moment without speaking. Outside the great doors the November afternoon was grey and cold, the grounds dimly visible through the windows. The 1612 Charter provision, she said finally. Appendix 7, subsection 4, Hermione said. It's quite clear. I'm aware of what it says, McGonagall said. I am wondering where you found it. The Hogwarts Library has a complete copy of the Foundation Charter, Harry said. Restricted section 3rd shelf behind the volume on the founder's original correspondence. A pause, which we also read. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The headmaster would like a word with you both. Now, Harry said, when you're ready, he's in his office. She paused. He seemed pleased, in the way he gets pleased when something surprises him. She looked at Harry with an expression of someone standing at a junction of personal feelings and professional responsibility, and navigating it with characteristic precision. Your mother would have done exactly the same thing, Potter. I want you to know that. Harry looked at her. She met his gaze directly and steadily, and he thought, she knew his mother not as a figure in a story but as a person, and the comparison was being made carefully with full knowledge of both sides of it, and it was being given to him as a real thing. Thank you, Professor, he said quietly. Don't let it go to your head, she said, and walked away. Hermione sat with him in the corridor outside the headmaster's office that evening while they waited to go up, both of them reading her a text on political structures in wizarding governance, him a book on blood protections that Snape had added to his informal reading list the previous week. Ron arrived 10 minutes in, having been told by the fat lady that they weren't in the common room. He sat on the floor opposite them and said, Ginny told me what you did in the board meeting. It's already in the Gryffindor common room. Fred and George are calling you Lord actually. Please tell them not to, Harry said. Absolutely not, Ron said. I think it's funny. He stretched his legs out. Malfoy's going to be worse now. Draco, I mean, his dad got stopped by an 11-year-old. He's going to hear about that. I know, Harry said. I've been thinking about that. And Draco Malfoy, Harry said, choosing his words carefully, is not his father. He's been handed his father's values like furniture in a room he was born in. He hasn't decided yet if he wants to keep it all or throw any of it out. He looked at the page he wasn't really reading. I think that's worth considering. Ron was quiet for a moment. You're hoping he'll... I'm not hoping anything specific, Harry said. I'm leaving room, there's a difference. Hermione, without looking up from her book, said, That's the smartest thing you've said all day. I said a lot of smart things today, Harry said. Yes, she said, and that was the smartest. Ron made a sound that was mostly laughter with some disbelief mixed in, and the corridor settled around them, old stone and old magic, November cold coming through the windows, 3 11-year-olds who had spent their first term becoming something the world hadn't expected. The gargoyle on the landing turned to look at Harry with the solid, settled attention of something that has made an assessment and filed it permanently. Harry turned back to his book. There were things still coming. He could feel them the way you feel weather before it arrives, a pressure in the air, a quality of attention in the castle itself that had been sharpening since Halloween. The something in Quirrell's turban was patient, but patience had limits. Lucius Malfoy would come back with better preparation and sharper tools. Sirius Black was in Azkaban for a crime Harry was increasingly certain he hadn't committed. And somewhere in Albania on a cold hillside, something that had once been the most feared dark wizard in living memory was doing its own slow calculations and waiting for the right fool to carry it home. Harry turned a page. He noted 3 things of significance in the chapter on blood protections and underlined them in the careful way he'd developed over summer of research, which meant, this connects to something else, file it. He was ready, or rather he was becoming ready, which was better because becoming ready never stopped. Chapter 5. The Stone and the Serpent. The letter from Gringotts arrived on a Monday in May. Harry was eating breakfast when Hedwig landed in front of him with the particular urgency she reserved for correspondence she'd been given at speed, and the envelope bore Ragnarok's personal seal, not the standard Gringotts institutional mark but the senior director's own, which Harry had only seen twice before. He opened it without ceremony. The letter was 4 lines. The tracking notation on the Peveril instrument has updated. The life signature previously recorded in Albania has moved. Current location, United Kingdom. Specific placement, active magical site, Southern England. The notation was updated 48 hours ago. We thought you should know immediately. Harry read it twice. He looked up. Hermione was watching him from across the table with the expression she wore when she was waiting for information she had already half deduced from his face. He passed the letter across without a word. She read it, her jaw tightened by a fraction. She passed it to Ron, who read it and put his fork down. He's here, Ron said quietly. Part of him, Harry said. The part that's been riding Quirrell all year. He looked down the table to where Neville was talking to Seamus about something entirely unrelated, and further to the staff table where Quirrell was eating with the careful precision of a man whose hands occasionally did things he hadn't told them to. He doesn't need Albania anymore. He's already inside the school. He's going to move soon, Hermione said. The stone. She had her notebook out, not to write anything new but as a reflex, something to hold while she thought. The end-of-year exams start in 3 weeks. If he wants to use the chaos of the exam period as cover, he won't wait that long, Harry said. He's been here all year. Waiting was the strategy while he was building strength. The tracking notation updating means something changed. He's ready. Ron looked at the staff table again. Dumbledore was not there. He hadn't been at breakfast for the last 3 days, which Harry had noted and filed. Where's Dumbledore? Ministry, Harry said. He got an urgent summons 2 days ago. I think it was manufactured. He picked his fork back up because eating was still necessary regardless of what was happening, a principle he'd absorbed from a summer of learning to function in the presence of significant information. Whoever's helping Quirrell beyond Quirrell is clever enough to clear the board first. So what do we do? Ron said. Harry looked at Hermione. Hermione said, we go tonight. They spent the day in a controlled kind of urgency that felt, Harry thought, like the space before a storm, everything very clear, every detail acquiring the particular sharpness of things that matter. They went to their classes. They did not make any visible departure from routine. Between charms and transfiguration, Harry slipped into McGonagall's empty classroom and wrote 2 letters, one to Dumbledore at the Ministry outlining what they knew and what they intended, and one to Ragnarok at Gringotts noting the update and their response. He sent them both with the school owls before lunch. He couldn't promise Dumbledore would get the letter in time. He sent it anyway because it was the right thing to do, not to ask permission but to inform. The difference mattered. In the afternoon he found Neville in the common room and sat across from him and said, tonight might be the night I mentioned, the one where I said you might need to do something brave. Neville put his book down. He'd changed since September incrementally, the way things change when someone stops removing the support from under them, small and then sudden. He'd been working with Harry and Hermione on theory twice a week all year. His practical spellwork was still inconsistent, but his understanding had expanded, and Harry had noticed that when Neville understood something conceptually, he could execute it. It was the confidence gap, not the ability gap. What do I need to do? If we're not back by midnight, Harry said, go to McGonagall, tell her exactly where we went and why. Don't embellish, don't soften it, just tell her. Neville looked at him steadily. Where are you going? Through the 3rd floor corridor and down, to the stone. Neville had been present for enough of their research conversations to have filled in the shape of the thing, even without every detail. His voice was level. What if McGonagall's already asleep? Wake her up, Harry said. She'll be annoyed. She'll also be exactly who we need. Neville nodded. Then he said, I want to come. You're more useful here, Harry said. That's not me keeping you out. That's the actual tactical situation. If we don't come back, we need someone who knows the plan, and that person has to be somewhere safe enough to reach McGonagall. That's you. Neville thought about it. He picked up his book again and then put it down again and said, come back. That's the plan, Harry said. They went at 11. Harry had the invisibility cloak, which had been in his trunk since September and which he had spent considerable time thinking about the ethics of. It was his by right, property of House Peveril, and the Deathly Hallows connection made it something more than a simple invisibility aid. Under it, the three of them moved through the castle with the specific silence of people who had been navigating these corridors for 8 months and knew which stairs creaked and which portraits were actually awake at this hour. The third-floor corridor was unlocked. The door swung open at Harry's touch without a sound, which was either the castle helping or the castle knowing this was already decided, and Harry thought it was probably both. They went through. Fluffy was asleep. The harp in the corner was playing quietly. Someone had been here before them recently and had put the dog under, and the music was still going. Harry looked at the trapdoor in the floor, at the enormous pause around it, and felt the weight of the night settle into its real shape. They were doing this. They were doing this on purpose, with full knowledge of what was on the other side, because Dumbledore's passive approach had run out of time and someone had to go through that door. Together, Hermione said. Ron pulled the trapdoor open. They dropped through. The devil's snare hit them in the dark, thick and immediate, vines moving with the instinctive intelligence of a plant that had been trained to do one thing. Harry went still instantly, the cold stillness of relaxation, and felt the vines slow. Beside him he heard Hermione already casting, the quiet lumos solemn producing a light that drove the plant back in scorched, retreating tendrils. Ron said, "That was fast." "I've been practicing that specific countermeasure since October," Hermione said. They dropped into the room below. The dark was complete until Harry cast his own lumos, holding it higher, the light filling the chamber with the angular shadows of hundreds of winged keys hovering near the ceiling. In the far wall, a locked door. Ron looked up. "One of them opens it." "Old-fashioned iron key," Harry said, scanning the swarm. "Silver wings, probably the one that looks slightly bent from previous use." He'd read Flitwick's research papers on charms-based locking mechanisms. The key most often used bore the marks of repeated insertion. There, he stepped onto the nearest broomstick. They were stacked against the wall, old-school brooms with variable handling, and went up. The keys moved in the alert, skittish manner of creatures that had been living at ceiling level for months and had developed territorial instincts. He tracked the bent-winged key through the swarm, cut off its flight path, and caught it cleanly on the second attempt. His Quidditch reflexes. He'd been on the Gryffindor team since October, youngest seeker in a century. The position had arrived with the same inevitability as everything else this year, pulling him to the right angle without conscious effort. He dropped back down. They went through the door. The chess game was enormous and silent and waiting. The pieces stood in ranks on either side of a board that stretched the width of the chamber, black marble against white marble, every piece battle-worn and patient. Ron walked to the edge of the board and looked at it for a long moment with an expression Harry recognized, the specific sharpening that happened in Ron when something he genuinely understood presented itself. He'd been playing chess since he could reach the pieces. He saw the board the way Harry saw the air on a broomstick, not intellectually but in his bones. "I can get us through," he said, "but I'll need to take a piece's place." "Ron," Hermione started. "It's chess," Ron said. "The board has to accept a player. One of us stands in for a piece and plays it through." He looked at the board again. "Knight, I take the knight's position. I can see the whole board from there and get us across in 7 moves. He looked at Harry. "If I get taken, you won't," Harry said, because Ron had already worked out the sequence and Harry trusted his chess entirely. "Probably not," Ron said, "but if I do, keep going, don't stop." He walked to the white knight's position. The piece looked at him for a moment, ancient marble eyes somehow, and then stepped aside. Ron got on the horse. The black pieces came to life. What followed was 7 minutes of the most extraordinary chess Harry had ever seen. Though he was not a chess player in any formal sense, he could appreciate the quality of the strategy even without being able to execute it himself. Ron moved them across the board like a conductor, always 3 moves ahead, sacrificing pieces only when the sacrifice created the path, and his voice never wavered, though Harry could see his knuckles white on the horse's reins. On the 6th move, the Black Queen moved toward Ron's knight and Harry's chest went tight, but Ron had already accounted for it. The Queen took a rook instead, the sacrifice Ron had planted, and the path opened and the king on the black side tilted its crown toward Ron in the specific slow movement of chess pieces acknowledging defeat. "Go," Ron said. His voice was steady. "I'll wait here." "We're coming back this way," Harry said. "I know, go." They went. The troll in the next chamber was already unconscious, which was the first indication that Quirrell had come through this way recently and hadn't bothered being subtle about it. Harry checked the chamber quickly and moved on. Hermione had already identified the door ahead and was working through the potions puzzle before Harry finished his check. 7 bottles on a table, a fire blocking the exit ahead and a fire blocking the return, a rolled parchment with a riddle that Hermione read once and then looked up from with an expression of genuine offense at its underestimation of her. 2 bottles get us through," she said. "1 for forward, 1 for back." Pointed to the smallest bottle on the right and the round bottle in the middle. "It would take the average person several minutes. I'd rather not take several minutes." "How long did it take you?" "I read the riddle," she said. "That was enough." She picked up the round bottle and held it out to him. "This one gets you forward." "Both of us," Harry said. She shook her head. "It's a small amount, enough for one." She picked up the small bottle. "I'll go back through the fire, get Ron, we'll wait." Hermione, Harry, Her voice was very clear and very direct, the way it got when she'd already made the decision and was past the discussion stage. You go forward, I go back, those are the correct tactics. She looked at him with brown eyes that were at this precise moment completely unafraid. You've been preparing for this all year, you know what's in there, go deal with it. He looked at her for a moment, she looked back. There was something passing between them in that look that had been building since July, since a Gringotts side street and a shared table in flourish and blots, since 14 letters and 8 months of Thursday evenings and the particular intimacy of two people who think similarly and have learned to trust that about each other. Be careful going back through, he said. The potion protects against the fire's effect, she said, which was her way of saying I know what I'm doing, which was true. She handed him the round bottle. Go. Harry drank the potion and walked through the black fire. The final chamber was large and cold and lit by an eerie ambient light from the Mirror of Erist, which stood against the far wall, ornate and enormous, exactly as described in the Peveril archive text that had included a historical notation on the mirror's construction. The Philosopher's Stone was involved in the mirror's protection. Harry had worked that out from Dumbledore's published writings on reflective enchantments, which had an oddly specific footnote about desire-based protections, and he understood the mechanism. You could only retrieve the stone if you wanted to find it without wanting to use it. Quirrell was already there. He was standing in front of the mirror with his back to Harry, his purple turban slightly askew, and the quality of stillness in the room had the particular tension of someone who has been trying to solve something and cannot. I wondered how long it would take you, Quirrell said without turning around. His voice was completely without the stutter. The boy who lived, the Lord of Three Houses, here at the end of it. Turn around, Professor, Harry said. Quirrell turned. His face in the mirror's light was pale and tired and frightened in a way the stutter had been obscuring all year. He looked like a man who had been carrying something terrible for a long time and no longer had the energy to carry it the way he'd planned. You know what I am, Quirrell said. You're a defense teacher who made a bad choice in Albania, Harry said. I know what's with you, I'm less interested in you. Then you understand, said the other voice, and it was the other voice now, the one underneath, pressing through Quirrell's throat with the cold clarity of something that did not waste energy on performance. Come and look in the mirror, boy. Harry didn't move. I know how the mirror works, he said to Quirrell, to the voice in Quirrell, to both at once. I know that the stone only appears to someone who wants it and won't use it. You can't get it. You've been standing there trying to force the mechanism and you can't, because the mechanism is designed for exactly the kind of person you aren't. A silence. You think yourself clever, the cold voice said. I think I've been researching this since September, Harry said, which is longer than you've been in this room. The turban shifted, began to unravel. Harry had expected this and he didn't look away. He'd read the descriptions in the Peveril documents, the notation on the soul fragment, the specific characteristics of a disembodied soul remnant attached to a living host. The face that emerged from the back of Quirrell's head was barely a face, a suggestion of what had once been a face, pale and flat-nosed, the red eyes burning with the cold fury of something reduced to a fraction of itself and wholly aware of the indignity. Voldemort. A piece of him, the piece that had survived Godric's hollow on borrowed life. Give me the stone, the fragment said, and I will give you your parents back. Harry looked at it steadily. You can't give me my parents back, he said. Nothing can, and even if you could, I wouldn't trade the stone for it because the stone in your hands doesn't just affect me, it affects everyone. He held the voice's gaze, the red burning eyes, and felt nothing that was fear, felt something more complex, more specific. The particular anger of someone who has spent a year understanding the full shape of what this thing had done to the world and to his family and to every person in the wake of its choices. You killed my parents to get to me and you failed, and you've been failing ever since. Voldemort's face contorted. You are a child. I'm a lord of 3 ancient houses and the heir of a 4th, standing in a room protected by Found-Era magic, carrying a wand made from the same phoenix feather as yours, Harry said. And I know things about what you are that you don't know I know. He paused. How many Horcruxes did you make? Silence. Real silence, the deep kind, the kind that happens when you've said the word that breaks something open. The red eyes narrowed. Who told you? Nobody told me, Harry said. I found it in the Peveril inheritance documents, cross-referenced with blood magic research, and confirmed it with a month of restricted section reading. You split your soul to survive. He kept his voice level, clinical, the way he'd kept it through every conversation this year that required clarity over emotion. Which means even if Quirrell got the stone tonight, even if you used it to get a body back, you'd still be incomplete. The other anchors still exist. You'd have power, yes. But you'd have it in a fragmented, degraded state, and you'd know it, and it would make everything you did next more desperate and more visible. He tilted his head. That's not a threat, that's just the calculation. The fragment of Voldemort stared at him with the red eyes burning and something behind them, not admiration, nothing so human but recognition. The recognition of something ancient and calculating, looking at something that is, unexpectedly, worth calculating about. You cannot stop what is coming, the fragment said, and the cold had gone from the voice, replaced by something more genuine, something that was almost in its terrible way direct. I will return, the other anchors will keep me tethered to life. I will find a way back to a body, and when I do, when you do, Harry said, I'll be ready, so will a lot of other people. He looked at Quirrell, at the exhausted, terrified man who had carried something monstrous for a year and worn it on his head, and was now in this chamber, very close to whatever end this had always been building toward. This doesn't need to end here with him, though. Don't, the fragment said, and the word was sharp, warning Quirrell, warning itself. The host is still alive, Harry said to Quirrell directly. Whatever you chose in Albania, you're still here. You could, he cannot help you, the fragment said. He is mine. He's a person, Harry said. That's the thing you never quite understood. The people you use remain people regardless. Then he stepped to the mirror. He looked into it. He knew what he was supposed to see, the desire of his heart, his parents alive, himself whole and unalone. And he felt the pull of that, the deep particular ache of it, but below the pull he felt the thing that had been growing all year in the reading and the research and the Thursday evenings and the letters and every moment of choosing to act instead of waiting to be acted upon. What he wanted in the truest sense was not the stone for himself. What he wanted was the world that existed when the stone was safe, and Voldemort was truly gone and Sirius Black was free, and the Wizengamot had been reformed, and Hermione's inheritance was recognized without asterisks, and Neville Longbottom was never again told he was inadequate. The stone dropped into his pocket. He'd felt it before he saw it, a warmth specific and small against his leg. He reached in and closed his hand around it and looked up from the mirror at the red eyes. That's not possible, the fragment said. You've been saying that about me since I was 14 months old, Harry said. It hasn't been accurate yet. Quirrell moved. He moved fast with the speed of something that was not entirely Quirrell driving the motion and grabbed Harry's wrist with both hands, and the contact was immediate and wrong in a way Harry hadn't expected, a searing burn, sharp and specific, running up his arm from the point of contact. But the burn ran both ways. He watched Quirrell's hands. The skin where they gripped his wrist was blistering, cracking, the magic in Harry's blood, his mother's sacrifice, the protection still active after 10 years, the one Dumbledore had called the oldest magic, the one that lived in his blood and in the walls of his aunt's house and in everything Lily Potter had chosen, reacting to contact with the fragment of the thing that had killed her. Quirrell cried out. The grip broke. The fragment screamed, a sound without a throat, without a body, just sound and fury and something very close to fear, and Quirrell fell, and the purple mist that rose from him as he hit the stone floor was nothing Harry had a word for yet, though he would later when he'd had time to research it properly. It was the departure of a soul remnant from a living host, forced out by the catastrophic failure of the vessel, and it passed through Harry with a cold that was absolute and brief and left no mark. Quirrell lay on the stone floor. He was breathing, shallowly but breathing. Harry stood in the empty chamber with the stone in his pocket and the mirror reflecting a version of the room that had nothing in it that wasn't there. He looked at the mirror for one more moment. He thought about what he'd seen in it, the world he wanted, the large and complicated world, and then he turned away, because the mirror showed you what you wanted, and the only way to actually get it was to leave the room and do the work. He knelt next to Quirrell and checked his pulse and cast the only diagnostic spell he knew with enough confidence to trust it, which he'd learned from a medical magic text in the restricted section in February, because it had seemed like the kind of thing worth knowing. Quirrell was alive, damaged, perhaps permanently, but alive. Harry took off his outer robe and draped it over Quirrell's shoulders. Then he stood up, put his hand in his pocket to confirm the stone was still there, and walked back through the black fire into the logic puzzle room. Hermione was on the other side. She had come back. Ron was beside her, slightly unsteady from the chess room but upright and present, and behind both of them stood McGonagall with her wand out, and the expression of a woman who has received a note from Neville Longbottom, processed it in 30 seconds, and made directly for the third-floor corridor with the focused velocity of someone who decided years ago never to waste time being surprised. Harry walked out of the black fire and Hermione looked at him, at his face, his arm where Quirrell had gripped him, the robe now missing from his shoulders, with the rapid, comprehensive attention of someone doing an inventory. "Are you hurt?" she said. "My wrist, it's minor." He reached into his pocket and held up the stone. In the blue-tinted light of the potion chambers it was small and red and utterly ordinary-looking, which seemed like a design flaw for something that could extend life indefinitely. "Quirrell is down, the fragment departed, he's alive, needs medical care." McGonagall looked at the stone with the expression of someone who has suspected something for 8 months and has just been confirmed right, which was not the same as being pleased about it. "Give that to me, Potter." Harry handed it over without hesitation. McGonagall closed her hand around it and said, "We're going to have a very long conversation about this." "I know," Harry said. "I sent Dumbledore a letter this morning explaining what we were doing. He may be back by now." McGonagall looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. It had too many layers. Then she looked at Hermione, who was tying a strip of fabric from her sleeve around Harry's wrist with the careful competence of someone who had read a basic field healing guide in October for exactly this kind of situation. "Granger," McGonagall said. "Yes, Professor." "You came back through the fire. The potion provided adequate protection," Hermione said, finishing the knot. "That fire burns at several hundred degrees." "I calculated the exposure time required," Hermione said. "It was acceptable." McGonagall closed her eyes briefly, then she opened them and said, "Right, Weasley, you're ambulatory." "Bit sore," Ron said. "The chess, I saw," she said. "We'll have Madame Pomfrey look at all of you." She looked at Harry one more time. The headmaster will want to speak with you tonight. Good, Harry said. I have some things I want to say to him too. McGonagall made a sound, not quite a laugh, something that had the shape of a laugh without committing to being one, and led them out of the chamber toward the trapdoor. Harry went last. At the door he stopped and looked back at the mirror, which stood in the empty room with the neutral patience of an object that does not care what happens next, and he thought about Voldemort's fragment moving through him on its way out, that cold absolute transit, and how he'd felt it fully and it had left no darkness in him because there was nothing in him that responded to it. His mother had given him that. Years ago in a house in Godric's Hollow on a night he didn't remember. He was going to spend the rest of his life making it worth giving. He went through the door. Chapter 6, What We Build. Dumbledore was back by midnight. Harry knew because the castle told him, not in words, not in any way he could have explained to someone who hadn't spent a year learning to feel the school's particular attention, but in the quality of the air on the 7th floor, the way the portraits straightened slightly in their frames, and the torches burned a shade more steadily. The headmaster had returned, and the castle registered it the way a house registers the return of its oldest resident. Harry was sitting in the hospital wing with a properly bandaged wrist. Madame Pomfrey had tutted at Hermione's field dressing while also, he noticed, unwrapping it with care and re-examining the knot before replacing it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, waiting for the conversation he'd known was coming since May. Ron was in the bed beside his, technically under observation for what Pomfrey called residual shock from magical displacement during the chess game, which Ron had translated as got knocked about a bit, and Hermione had translated as the chess pieces hit him twice and he pretended they hadn't. He was eating chocolate frogs and reading the cards with the particular ease of someone who has been through something intense and come out the other side, and is processing it by doing something simple. Hermione was in the chair between the two beds. She had her notebook open. She was not writing in it. This was unusual enough that Harry kept noticing it. He'll come here first, she said without looking up from the blank page. I know, Harry said. We should decide before he arrives what we're going to say and what we're going to ask. I know, she looked up. Well, I'm going to say what happened, accurately and completely, and I'm going to ask about the Horcruxes directly. He knows we know the word. I said it to the fragment tonight and the fragment's reaction confirmed everything. Dumbledore needs to know we have the full picture now, not just the edges of it. Hermione looked at him for a moment, then she said, he's going to try to tell us we're too young. I know. What do you say to that? Harry thought about it. He thought about Quirrell on the stone floor and the mirror showing him the world he wanted and his mother's magic running through his blood like a current. He thought about 3 lordships and a sum of reading and 8 months of understanding how the world they'd walked into actually worked underneath its performance. He thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban and Voldemort in Albania, rebuilding himself and a board of governors that had real power and a ministry that needed reforming, and a Wisengamot that Hermione had been quietly filing preliminary research into since October. I say that too young is a description, not an argument, he said. We're too young to be in this situation, that's true, but we're in it. The question isn't whether we should be, the question is what we do now that we are. Hermione was quiet for a moment, then good, say that. Ron said from his bed, can I say something too? You're not coming to the meeting, Ron, Hermione said. I know. I just wanted to say, he paused, looking at them both with the particular honesty he'd had since the train, the quality that Harry valued as much as almost anything else about him. You're both completely mad, and I mean that as a compliment, and I'm staying in this whatever it is so you know. Harry looked at him. Whatever it is going to get more complicated. Obviously, Ron said and turned over a chocolate frog card. Oh, I've got Dumbledore, that's funny. Dumbledore arrived 20 minutes later. He came through the hospital wing door with the particular quality of a man who has been moving quickly and has composed himself before entering, and Harry registered the details. The travelling cloak not fully exchanged for his usual robes, the eyes slightly more present behind the half-moon glasses than usual, the warm expression present but with less of the performance layer. Come straight from whatever the ministry had wanted him for, and before that he'd presumably received Harry's letter. He stood at the foot of Harry's bed and looked at him and said, You went down. We went down, Harry said. Quirrell was already through. The fragment was with him. If we'd waited, he would have the stone. Dumbledore sat in the chair Pomfrey had placed with the resigned efficiency of a woman who has been dealing with the aftermath of these two people's decisions all year. I read your letter en route. He was quiet for a moment. Quirrell is stable. He's being transferred to St. Mungo's where the treatment is more comprehensive than what we can offer here. The prognosis is uncertain. He paused. The departure of a soul remnant from a living host causes significant damage. He may recover, he may not. I know, Harry said. He'd known that when he watched the mist rise from Quirrell's body, he had not been able to prevent it. He had not caused it directly. He held both those things and carried them without putting them down. What was in Albania is gone from this location, but it's not destroyed. No, Dumbledore said. He looked at Harry with the careful, measured attention of someone deciding something. It will find another host, another body, another way. It is persistent. A pause, and you know why. Horcruxes, Harry said. The word settled in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Dumbledore did not look surprised. He looked, Harry thought, like a man who has been carrying a weight alone for a long time and has just felt someone else put their hands on it too. You found the word in the Peverell documents. and confirmed it in the restricted section, and cross-referenced it with blood magic historical texts and the Albania tracking notation. Harry held Dumbledore's gaze. How many did he make? I believe 6, Dumbledore said. 6 deliberate creations. A 7th was made accidentally without his intention on the night he came to Godric's Hollow. A pause, significant and weighted. The accidental Horcrux is the most complicated one. Harry understood the pause. He felt it land in him, the implication of it, and he sat with it for a moment without speaking because some things needed a moment. Me, he said. I believe so, Dumbledore said. The fragment that struck you when the curse rebounded, I believe a piece of Voldemort's soul anchored in you, in the scar. He looked at Harry's forehead. I have been trying to determine for some years how to address that particular complication without discussing it with you, because discussing it required explaining what you were carrying and I was not certain. You weren't certain I could handle it, Harry said. I was not certain it was the right burden to give a child, Dumbledore said, and the distinction was real. Harry heard it, the difference between couldn't handle it and shouldn't have to, and he credited it. I'd rather know, Harry said. I'd always rather know. I understand that now, Dumbledore said quietly. I understood it from your letter in July if I am honest with myself, and I have not been entirely honest with myself this year about several things. He folded his hands in the way he had when he was saying something that cost him something to say. I made decisions about your life that I had no right to make. The guardianship, the funds, leaving you with the Dursleys without adequate oversight or support. I told myself it was necessary, the blood wards, the protection, the requirement for you to be in a place of safety, and all of that was true. But I told myself those truths so thoroughly that I stopped asking whether there were other ways to achieve the same protections with less cost to you. That was wrong. I am sorry for it. Harry looked at him. He thought about 10 years in a cupboard and oversized clothes and a birthday that nobody at number 4 had ever acknowledged, and the first time someone had asked him if he was all right in the back of a car on his 11th birthday, and how the question had caught him off guard. I know you thought you were doing the right thing, Harry said. That doesn't make all of it right. But I know the difference between someone who made bad choices because they were careless and someone who made bad choices because they were trying to protect something and got the calculations wrong. He paused. We're going to need to work together. Actually together, not you managing and me being managed, if that's possible. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not quite grief, not quite relief, something that had the qualities of both. I believe, he said finally, that it is not only possible but necessary. He looked at Harry with the eyes of a man who has lived a very long time and learned a great many things, most of them the hard way. You are not what I expected. You expected someone easier to work with, Harry said. I expected someone I could guide, Dumbledore said. I find instead someone I can work alongside. That is considerably more valuable and considerably more challenging. The corners of his eyes moved in the way Harry had come to associate with his genuine warmth, the kind not deployed for effect. Your parents would be extraordinarily proud of you. I want you to know I mean that as a statement of fact, not a pleasantry. Harry nodded. He didn't trust himself to say anything to that, not immediately, and Dumbledore, who was, whatever else he was, a man of considerable perceptiveness, let it rest. Hermione's conversation with Dumbledore happened the next morning in his office, and Harry wasn't present for it. She told him about it afterward in the hospital wing, where he was still technically a patient, sitting cross-legged on his bed with his notebook while Ron built an elaborate tower from chocolate frog boxes. He asked about the Selwyn and Dagworth Granger lines, she said. Whether I'd looked into them fully, whether I understood the implications in terms of Wisengamot's standing. Do you? Harry asked. Partly. The Selwyn connection gives me a seat on the Wisengamot with conditions attached. I need to formally claim it after turning 17, but the seat exists and is waiting. The Dagworth Granger designation is complicated because the last holder made certain oaths that affect how the inheritance can be used, but Ragnok thinks the oaths are dissolvable through a specific ritual that I need to research further. She paused. He seemed, I don't know the exact word. He seemed like someone who had been thinking about these things for a long time and wasn't sure he wanted to bring them up, but decided to because not bringing them up was the kind of choice he'd been making too often. That's a very specific read, Ron said, placing a chocolate frog box with architectural care. He said something like that himself, actually, Hermione said, almost those words. She looked at her notebook. He also said that the reforms I've been researching, the Muggle-born rights proposals, the inheritance law standardization, the Wisengamot representation adjustments, have been needed for 40 years and that he has been the primary reason they haven't happened because he has been too focused on Voldemort to push for anything that created additional political opposition. Harry said, he admitted that. He said, and I'm quoting because I wrote it down, I have used the threat of Voldemort as a reason not to move the world forward, because moving the world forward creates resistance and resistance creates vulnerability and I could not afford vulnerability. I told myself this was prudent. I think it was cowardice of a very particular kind, the kind that looks like strategy. Silence except for the soft sound of a chocolate frog box being placed on top of the tower. Blimey, Ron said. I think, Harry said slowly, that he's going to be different to work with from now on. Not different in the sense of transformed, different in the sense of someone who stopped managing things and started actually discussing them. Maybe, Hermione said, she was being careful, which was her right. She'd had less time with him than Harry, less accumulated context, and she was reserving judgment in the way she always reserved judgment until the evidence warranted a conclusion. He's still Dumbledore, he's still the most powerful political figure in British wizarding society, and he's spent 60 years getting his own way. People change, Harry said. Some do, she said. We'll see. The last week of term was strange in the way of all weeks that come after something significant, the world continuing its routines while the people inside it carry a new shape of things. Exams arrived and happened. Harry sat through them with the particular competence of someone who had been reading at a serious level for 10 months, and found that the exams mostly tested things he'd covered in September. He got full marks on the charms practical, which made Flitwick bounce slightly. He got full marks on the theory components for transfiguration, potions, and history of magic, which made McGonagall say nothing out loud but update something in her notebook with a satisfaction that Harry could see from 2 rows back. Hermione got full marks on everything. Ron passed everything cleanly, which was more significant than the numbers suggested. It was the first time, he told Harry, that he hadn't walked out of an assessment feeling like he'd missed at least 3 things, and he attributed it, with the honesty that was one of his best qualities, to the Thursday evening sessions. The end-of-year feast happened on a Friday, and Dumbledore gave the usual House Points awards before dinner, which resulted in Gryffindor winning the House Cup for reasons that were largely Harry and Hermione and the events of the previous weeks. There was a specific warmth in the hall that Harry hadn't felt before, or hadn't been in a position to feel, the warmth of belonging, which was different from the warmth of being liked, more structural, more certain. Neville received 20 points for services to the school, which Dumbledore described as requiring a particular kind of bravery, the kind that asks you to trust people and hold the line while they do what they need to do. Neville went scarlet and then steady, and when the Gryffindor table applauded, he didn't immediately look down. Harry watched him and thought, that's what it looks like when someone starts to understand what they're capable of. Draco found him on the last evening before the train. Harry was on the 7th floor corridor, the invisibility cloak folded under his arm because he'd been to visit the Room of Requirement, which he'd found in March following a reference in the Founder's correspondence, and which had become, over the last 2 months, his preferred place for thinking through complicated things. He came around a corner and there was Draco, leaning against the wall with the posture of someone who has been waiting but doesn't want to appear to have been waiting. Draco looked at him. Harry looked at Draco. How do you know I'd come this way? Harry asked. The portrait of the medieval witch on the 3rd floor, Draco said. She told me you came up here sometimes in the evenings. She didn't tell me why. A pause. She doesn't like my family much. Most of the castle's portraits have strong opinions about most families, Harry said. He leaned against the opposite wall and waited. Draco was doing the internal negotiation thing he'd been doing all year, the gap between the trained performance and the actual person underneath getting, as the year had progressed, slightly more visible. He said, my father wrote to me after the board meeting. I assumed he would. He said you embarrassed him. Draco's voice was careful, stripped of inflection in the way of someone who is reporting without editorializing, because editorializing would reveal something. He said you'd used procedural tricks to undermine legitimate governance concerns. The 1612 provision isn't a trick, Harry said. It's the law. I know that, Draco said. I looked it up. He paused. He also said you were dangerous, that you were going to dismantle everything important about wizarding society and replace it with, he said, Muggle values. He said it like it was the worst thing he could think of. Harry looked at him steadily. What do you think? Draco was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the corridor, the old stone, the torchlight, the particular quality of a Hogwarts evening. I think the things he calls important, Draco said slowly, are the things that are important to him specifically, and I think there's a difference between those 2 things. He looked at Harry. I've been thinking about it since September. I know, Harry said. I could tell. Draco blinked. Could you? You're intelligent. You're more honest than your presentation suggests. And you've spent this whole year testing the edges of things without fully committing to any direction. Harry said it without judgment. That's someone figuring something out. It takes as long as it takes. Draco looked at him with something that was complicated and young and considerably more real than anything he'd shown at the start of year. My father isn't, he's not wrong about everything, he said carefully. He loves his family, he believes in something. It's just, what he believes in requires other people to be less than they are, Harry said. That's the part that doesn't hold. I know, Draco said. He said it quietly, like something exhaled rather than stated, like a conclusion he'd reached alone and hadn't said out loud before. Harry looked at him. You don't have to decide anything right now, he said. You're 11, you've got time to work out what you actually think versus what you've been handed. And if what I work out is different from what my family thinks, then you'll have to decide what to do with that. That's not my problem to solve for you. A pause. But it's not an impossible situation. Families are complicated. People inside them can think differently and still. He stopped, because he didn't have the full sentence yet, the full version of what he was trying to say, which had something to do with the possibility of Draco Malfoy becoming a person separate from the political architecture of his family without the catastrophic rupture that seemed to be the only model available in the stories Harry had read. "You don't have to become the enemy of everything you came from," he said finally. "You just have to become yourself." Draco looked at him for a long moment, then he said, "That's either very simple or very complicated." "Both," Harry said. "Usually both." Draco pushed off from the wall. He stood for a moment with the particular uprightness of someone who has been raised to carry themselves a certain way and hasn't yet decided which parts of that to keep. "I'll see you on the train," he said. "Yeah," Harry said. Draco walked away down the corridor. Harry watched him go and thought, "That's not finished. That's barely started, but it started and that's different from nothing." The morning of departure, Harry and Hermione sat in the library for the last time, not to research or not primarily. They had their notebooks open on the table because neither of them were the kind of people who sat anywhere without their notebooks, but the work was different this morning. Hermione was writing the formal outline of the petition she intended to file with the Wizengamot once she was back in London, the first draft of the proposal to reform inheritance recognition for Muggle-born and half-blood witches and wizards, and Harry was drafting a second formal inquiry to Gringotts about Sirius Black's trial records, this one citing the evidence he'd spent the year accumulating. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the library scene from a story where two heroes sit in the aftermath of a great victory and speak profound truths to each other. It was just them working in the place they'd worked all year doing the next thing. "I've been thinking about the Horcrux problem over the summer," Hermione said without looking up. "Me too," Harry said. "We need more information about which objects he chose before we can make any progress. That means researching Voldemort's history, his early life, his time at Hogwarts, the objects that had meaning for him." She turned a page. "Some of that information will be in ministry files, some will be in private archives, some will only exist in the memories of people who knew him." "Dumbledore," Harry said, "and others, people who knew Tom Riddle before he was Voldemort." She looked up. "I think we should ask Dumbledore to share what he knows directly, not hints. Not guidance toward discoveries he wants us to make on our own, actual information." "He'll agree," Harry said. "After last night I think he's moved past the managed revelation approach." "We'll see," she said, which was where she always was with Dumbledore, watching and reserving. Harry respected it. He had his own version of it, just calibrated differently. He finished the Gringotts letter and looked at it. 12 months ago he hadn't known Sirius Black existed. He knew now that Sirius Black was his godfather, that the charge against him was mass murder and the betrayal of James and Lily Potter to Voldemort, and that the trial records Gringotts had been researching showed a single devastating fact: there had been no trial. Sirius Black had been sent to Azkaban without ever standing before the Wizengamot. Without a trial, without a wand examination, without anything that constituted due process under wizarding law. He had been put there and forgotten, and Dumbledore, and this was the part Harry had been sitting with for months, turning over with the care of someone trying to be fair to a complicated person. Dumbledore had allowed it in the chaos of the war's end because he had believed Sirius guilty, and because processing one more impossible thing in that season of impossible things had required more than he'd had left. The anger Harry felt about it wasn't the clean burning kind. It was the complicated kind, the kind that came from caring about someone and seeing clearly what they'd done and holding both at once. He felt it and he wrote the letter anyway because feeling it was not the same as acting from it, and acting well required the distinction. He sealed the letter. He'd send it from the station. "Hermione," he said, "do you know what you want to do, eventually, with all of this?" He gestured vaguely, which encompassed the notebooks and the petition and the Horcrux problem and the Wizengamot seat waiting for her at 17, and the entire complicated architecture of the magical world they'd walked into 11 months ago. She considered it properly, which was how she considered everything. "I want to change the inheritance laws," she said, "and the representation structures in the Wizengamot. And eventually the blood status classifications, which are scientifically incoherent and socially harmful and have no basis in actual magical capability." A pause. "The political work first because you can't do the social work sustainably without the legal framework. And in parallel the Horcrux research because none of the other work means very much if Voldemort comes back properly." She looked at him. Sirius first," Harry said, "then the Horcruxes." Then he paused because his version of the answer was less articulate than hers, more instinctive, but it was real. "I want to build something. I don't know exactly what yet. Something that uses what we have in a direction that makes things better for people who need them to be better." Looked at the library around them, the shelves that had given them almost everything this year, the place Madame Pince had eventually stopped watching with suspicion and started watching with the particular satisfaction of a librarian whose collection is being properly used. "The Lordships are tools. The Wizengamot seat is a tool. The Gringotts standing is a tool. I want to know what we're building with them." "We're building the answer to that question," Hermione said. "That's the work." Harry looked at her. She was 11 years old and had 2 lordships and a pending Wizengamot seat, and the finest mind he'd encountered in his 11 years of existing. and she was sitting in a school library on the last day of term drafting a petition to reform wizarding inheritance law, and she was his best friend. "Yeah," he said, "that's the work." The Hogwarts Express left at 11. They were in their compartment, the same formation as September, Harry and Hermione on one side, Ron across from them, with one addition. Neville, who had simply shown up at their carriage door and been waved in, and who fit the space as naturally as if he'd been there from the beginning, which in a real sense he had. The castle moved away behind them through the window, growing smaller over the green hills. Harry watched it until it was a distant collection of towers and then turned back to the compartment. Ron was asleep within 20 minutes, which was a talent Harry admired sincerely. Neville was reading a herbology text with the comfortable concentration of someone doing something they genuinely loved. Hermione had her petition notes out and was working in the particular absorbed silence that meant she was in the good part of the thinking. Harry had his notebook open to the list he'd started in July. Things that need addressing. He read through it. He crossed off some items. He added new ones in the margin: the Horcrux locations, the Wizengamot reform timeline, the question of how to approach Dumbledore about the memories he needed, the ongoing Sirius Black inquiry, the conversation he wanted to have with McGonagall about Lily Potter before September. The list was longer than it had been in July. The list would always be longer than it had been, because that was the nature of engaging seriously with the world. Every door opened showed you 3 more doors, and the work was not in reaching the end of the list but in doing the next thing on it well. He put his quill down and looked out the window at England running past, green and ordinary and full of people living their lives without knowledge of the things moving beneath the surface of it. Somewhere in that landscape, in Albania, possibly heading somewhere else by now, a soul fragment was rebuilding itself in whatever way damaged and desperate things rebuild themselves. Somewhere in Azkaban, a man he'd never met was in his 11th year of a wrongful imprisonment. Somewhere in Wiltshire, a father was writing a letter to a son who was starting to think for himself, and the gap between what the father wanted and what the son might become was quietly, irrevocably widening. The world was not saved. It was not close to saved. It was cracked open, Harry thought. The phrase from July came back to him, from the outline of what this year had been, cracked open and light was getting in, and the work of getting more light in was long and specific and not dramatic, mostly not in the way of stories. It was the work of Thursday evenings in the library and letters to Gringotts and questions asked directly and information shared honestly and the particular accumulated weight of a lot of small things done carefully. He could do that work. They could do it together and they could bring people along and the list would get longer and then some of it would get done and then the world would be a fractionally better version of itself, and that was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. Hermione looked up from her petition notes and said, "Stop thinking so loudly." "Am I?" he said. "You do this thing where you go very still when you're thinking about something large," she said. "It's distracting." "Sorry," he said, "not sorry at all." She looked at him for a moment with brown eyes that were warm in the specific way they'd become warm over 11 months of choosing to be in proximity to the same large difficult things and handling them together. "It was a good year," she said. "It was a complicated year," he said. "Yes," she said, "those are often the same thing." She went back to her petition. Harry picked up his quill. Outside, England continued. The train moved south toward London and the ordinary world and the summer that waited on the other side of it, full of Gringotts meetings and research and letters and the next layer of a work that had no clean ending. He wrote the first item on September's list and felt the rightness of it, the particular satisfaction of someone who has found the thing they're supposed to be doing and is doing it, and the train carried them home through the long, bright afternoon. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Granger home addressed to Hermione in handwriting she didn't immediately recognize. Inside was a single paragraph, formal and careful and stripped of anything that could be called warmth but present. "Miss Granger, I have reviewed the preliminary draft of your Wizengamot petition through channels I will not name. The argument in Section 4 regarding precedent is weak and will be attacked there first. The argument in Section 7 is strong and should be moved to lead the document. I am enclosing 3 relevant precedents you have not cited. Do not interpret this as endorsement. Interpret it as the correct use of a source that happens to be available." It was signed S. Snape. Hermione read it twice. She wrote back a letter that was also formal and careful and stripped of everything unnecessary, which said, "Thank you, I'll make the revisions. The 3 precedents are useful. The Section 4 weakness was already noted. I was testing whether reviewers caught it." "You did." She did not sign it as anything except Hermione Granger. She moved Section 7 to lead the document, and at number 4 Privet Drive, where Harry was spending his last summer in the house that had never been his home, a letter arrived from Gringotts on a Thursday morning. He opened it at the kitchen table while the Dursleys did their best to pretend he wasn't there, which he returned by doing his best to actually not be there in any way that mattered, his mind already past Privet Drive and into September. Letter was longer than Ragnarok's usual correspondence. It informed him that the formal inquiry into the trial records of Sirius Orion Black had been completed. It informed him that those records showed clearly and without ambiguity that no trial had been held, that no wand examination had been conducted, that the sole basis for the imprisonment was the testimony of Bartemius Crouch Sr., acting under wartime emergency powers that had expired before the imprisonment was formalized. It informed him that Gringotts, as a neutral institution, was prepared to submit these findings to the full Wisengamot on his formal request as heir to House Black. It said, "We await your instruction, Lord Potter Black." Harry read the letter. He read it a second time. He sat very still in the kitchen at Privet Drive for a long moment with the letter in his hands, and the summer morning outside the window, and the particular weight of something about to change resting in his chest, alongside the particular lightness of something wrong about to be put right. Then he picked up his quill and wrote back, "Please proceed." He sealed the letter and went to his room to get Hedwig, and the house was quiet around him, and outside in the ordinary world the summer turned and the work continued.